Hello and welcome everyone to the second part of the first episode of the Ardaranyë, the history of Arda, or the history of the Kingdom of Arda. I'm very lucky to be joined by Nathan Hood. Hello.
Good evening. Good to be here, and I've finally made it to Plebs here.
And Mr. Patriarch.
Good evening, gentlemen. Very happy to be here. Excited to dig it in some high IQ Tolkien analysis.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'm very lucky to have both of you on board. I mean, I'm hoping that as the series progresses and we get through, I don't know, 20 odd episodes, probably less than 30 to 40 weeks, I'll be able to get both of you or either of you on some of the time, hopefully. I do apologize, at the beginning of, I know I do apologize far too much on my streams,
Far
but I
too
think
much.
but I think it's warranted in this case because I think, as you can tell, the fact that I opted only to go for on the construction of the Silmarillion when it came to the reading component of this, this is probably the most difficult discussion I've had to structure and I've had to limit in terms of scope because um, I mean, I was, flitting through probably more articles, more sort of reading, going through my the histories of Middle Earth, more so than any other stream I've had to research for. There's no sort of chronological framework to confine us. There are no sort of strict themes which could be compartmentalized. Everything is interrelated. And Nathan, you were contacting me saying, what's the through line for this conversation, and roughly. I responded to you saying that obviously on the Silmarillion with the corollary, a mythology for Middle Earth, or for England rather, and I responded to you by saying a mythology for England should really be a mythology for England, a question rather than a statement. I mean, as I've delineated, this is both a law series and a historicity series, encompassing both literary and theological critiques. And this episode, both parts were meant to serve as an introduction. And when I read that article by Charles Node last week, I went over the construction of the Silmarillion, and I hoped that introduced, well, I don't hope it did, introduce Tolkien's literary fragments comprising the Silmarillion, and we went into what the definition of that was, rather than looking at Christopher Tolkien's edition of it from 1977. If you're just confronted with that piece of literature, it's going to be this whole series is going to be very confusing for you, especially this episode, which is dedicated to, in large part, due to the framing and the historicity of the series as a whole, which, of course, if you have read the Silmarillion, it's unmediated. There isn't a connecting voice or someone like Bilbo or Elfwine or some of these other figures which appear in earlier iterations to guide you through the narrative. And so, yes, this is going to be a broad question of how Tolkien attempted to tie all of this thing we call the Silmarillion into English history, mythology, via, in the framing device, Tolleresia, Ariel, Elfwine, and explain that the Silmarillion is not a fantasy novel, but rather, if you include all of the works that were meant to comprise the Silmarillion, the unfinished Silmarillion that was Tolkien's unfinished lifelong work, it is rather a matter of Middle Earth, like the matter of Britain, the matter of Rome, or the matter of France. So the through line of this discussion on the Silmarillion is, what is the Silmarillion? And the notion of it being a mythology for England, this is apocryphal. This, I believe, was coined by a book, a mythology for England, an assessment of Tolkien's art, which was published some 2 years after the publication of the Silmarillion in 1977. And of course, it was championed by Humphrey Carpenter. But as a quote, it's often attributed to Tolkien, but it wasn't something he ever said explicitly. So this will be the general impetus for the discussion. And as for a structure, my intent is to understand whether the whole Silmarillion is a created mythology, or Tolkien conceived of it as some form of received tradition. And I mentioned in my original lecture that this was intended to be a real history. Obviously, that might be a confusing notion for some in the audience. But as you recall, I did an interview a couple of weeks ago where I hosted Rachel Forden Brown, who very kindly gave her impression of what Tolkien's relationship with history is. And one part of that was the framing. One part of that was, time travel. And a lesser part of it, which I brought up, was the idea of historicity, the notion of, all of these influences comprising a big bubbling cauldron that is story. And then we have the idea of an asterisk history, i.e., going back as a philologist, reconstructing words that ought to be there and historical places that ought to be there. So this is a form of history as asterisk history, asterisk construction. And all of these factors will touch more or less on the central contention that Tolkien's work will be, possibly a mythology for England. So all of these things are interrelated. All of these things are interconnected in some way. So compartmentalizing this topic has been very difficult. But just before I ask the panel what their thoughts are on this in general, I thought I just wanted to give a real world comparison, or rather a literary mythological comparison, to help us along when we're talking about such things as the framing device. You are, all probably aware of the of Greco-Roman mythology, Zeus, Kronos, Hera, etc. That is essentially organized as a golden age. It begins with, the reign of Kronos. It begins with the creation of the immortals. It begins with the creation of the Olympian pantheon, and it degenerates into the Silver Age. And this degenerates in turn into the Bronze Age, and depending on your definition, whether it be Hesiod or whether it be Ovid, it either deviates into the Heroic Age and then the Iron Age, or this just deviates into the Iron Age, which is the land of men, demarcated by nations, boundaries, etc. And of course, this in some way, tangentially, if you look at the matter of Rome, links back into real history. So you have the gods linking us back to the story of the Trojan War. With the effect of the Trojan War is that we have the flight of Aeneas. Aeneas comes over and is the founding father of the Roman state, and he is supposed to be a grand sort of progenitor of Julius Caesar. And of course, this work was the Aeneid was written during the reign of Augustus. So all of that is, very much a central component of that work. But the point is, you have mythological events informing real world history, and there is some sort of tangible link between the Greco-Roman pantheon informing the events at Troy, which in turn, there's a whole historicity episode on this channel dedicated to Troy. And that links into the real world and coming up to the Roman Empire. So I think that's quite a useful way in terms of informing, how you can turn, mythology into history, essentially. It should also be noted that Tolkien, like Ovid, also does have 4 ages. Just a little note there. Yes, but before we go on, I've included a couple of extracts from various different sources, some from Tolkien himself, some from the essays, articles, which I've included in the description. Do either of you have any general points you want to make before we go on with the reading material?
I guess I would just add at this point that I think we see with Tolkien's understanding of the framing device for the Silmarillion or the Lost Tales, it develops over time and it changes, and it goes through various modifications, which might reflect his own shifting as to understanding what he's trying to do at various points with this work. And so that might be something worth exploring a little bit as we move on through the discussion.
Mr. Patriarch?
Yeah, one of the things I thought was really interesting and was sort of unaware about until kind of going through the literature a little bit and listening to your stream the other last week was his the influence of the, what was it called, that Finnish Kalevala.
Kalevala, yeah.
The Kalevala, and how the kind of his desire to sort of have this canon of, sort of mythical British sort of literature, and not only that, but how he saw language itself, the convention of different languages, as sort of absolutely necessary to sort of contextualizing basically a myth or a history, or sort of have people give develop a coherent view of itself. And one thing I didn't know until sort of prepping for this a little bit was sort of like when he went to get the Kalevala in order to read it, he wanted to read it in the original language. So he got like a grammar book, and he was very keen on sort of getting the exact ethos of the work in the original language. That's absolutely necessary, according to Tolkien as a philologist, to sort of making sense of both not just sort of historical artifacts, but sort of cultural artifacts of a society. And, just, I know it's anecdotal, but having lived in South Africa for a little bit, there's just like certain words which just convey a stronger meaning, like in Afrikaans, as opposed to like English or something. So I can definitely see where Tolkien's coming from, and his desire to sort of create his own languages as a way to better communicate and flesh out his world is really, really, really interesting. And I think something that really sets apart not only his work compared to other works of fantasy, but also for sort of understanding this broader context of sort of Tolkienology as sort of history, which is going to be sort of the subject of this stream series.
Yes, just to comment on both of your points. With your point, Nathan, the difficulty, not just for this episode, but going forward, because we don't have one definitive, approved canonical text, ironically, we are going to have to treat it as a matter, and Tolkien was aware of this fact, that this is a series of stories with different editions, by Tolkien himself, but various editions by Christopher Tolkien. And now that Christopher Tolkien, that work is continuing, there's just been a book published called the Nature of Middle Earth, just after Christopher Tolkien's death, or I think this was actually during, but when essentially he was unfortunately incapacitated. So the idea of a matter, in this case, a received sort of body of stories which is constantly evolving, is something that was had a major impact on Tolkien as he was working, and the fact that this is possibly this received tradition of stories, and that it should be conceived of as a matter rather than just a fantasy work. But of course, that does add problems as to continuity and in terms of internal consistency, and of course what we do deem canonical, because unlike doing a history of the real world series where the truth is independent of the sources, essentially, or the sources are supposed to relate to some sort of truth. In this, we are talking about a self-contained universe, and then we're talking about this links and applicability to real world history. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, which is going to be interesting to muddle through. In regards to your point, Mr. Patriarch, the Kalevala, to me, in my sort of superficial reading, especially in the early time, the Book of Lost Tales, I think the intention is almost clearer in the fact that Tolkien was almost trying to mimic and create his own version of the Kalevala with the Book of Lost Tales. However, that purpose, that meaning, becomes obscure, as time progresses, and becomes much more obscure after the publication of The Hobbit and the subsequent production of Lord of the Rings. How I wanted to start this, because I mentioned the idea of myth and history, and all these two things is almost interrelated. One referring to fantastical elements, one referring to truth, in the sense that one is referring to human action, not the action of the supernatural or the action of gods or demigods or what have you. And I have a little segment here from Tolkien's famous poem, I think 1931 poem that was published in Leaf and Tree, called Mythopoeic, which essentially is a Greek extraction meaning myth making. It wasn't a word coined by Tolkien, but it's very much one he embraced. And this, opens up two topics. One, the actual sort of usage and the value of myth as a device, as some sort of, historical device in this case, and the idea of defending myth against, secular critics. So he terms this in form of philometus versus misometus. And misometus is essentially the skeptic. And at this time, C.S. Lewis hadn't converted to Christianity, Anglicanism yet. So C.S. Lewis is very much seen as the critic, and Tolkien here is defending the value of mythology the value of these, what he would call sub-creations, against this secularizing tendency. But this also comes into another question, is to what extent is the work an act of creation, explicit creation by Tolkien, or whether Tolkien conceived of it as something else, almost something beyond him, like a independent mythology. So I'll just read this. It's only a small segment, and if either of you want to comment on it at the end, please do so. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, though whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues and endlessly combined, in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled, with elves and goblins though we dared to build, gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right. Used or misused, the right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. And then he goes on, there's a little segment, but linking this back. I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends, if by God's mercy progress ever ends, and does not ceaselessly revolve the same unfruitful course with changing of a name. I will not treat your dusty path and flat, denoting this and that by this and that, your word immutable wherein no part the little maker has with maker's art. I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down. So what do you two make of that little excerpt from Mythopoeic?
Sounds like he's dunking on progress. But no, I think it's interesting in sort of what you were talking about earlier with the philomythos, the idea of sort of embracing the myth. I think this is very important, and it's something that you see across all civilizations, pre-Enlightenment civilizations, for example. So, like, just as an anecdote, like Alaska Native, like the Aleuts, the tribe of the Aleuts, they have a pretty sort of elaborate mythology of their own, which was came into contact with sort of the Russian missionaries of the time. And they had their own sort of conception of sort of one divine being who sort of created the world. And then they had their different sort of other myths, sort of how the raven it was sort of responsible for sort of bringing the sunlight and all these sorts of things. And you can say, not to go all Jordan Peterson or whatever, but you could say they're sort of factually incorrect, but on a deeper level, they're true, right? And I think this is kind of the fundamental power of myth, and sort of the idea of sort of tut-tutting and sort of looking at everything with a a sort of skeptical empiricist scientism framework is very damaging in the sense that it sort of uproots sort of these things which are true but can't be quantified, right? So yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with the spirit of this poem that you read from Tolkien.
Just to chime in on that, the article on the Kalevala, it focuses on the kind of creation myth, and that will be the focus in a couple of weeks. But it focuses on two singers, as it were, and one of them tries to create their own new song, and it, excuse the pun, falls flat, and is a lie essentially. Whereas the one that kind of wins the contest is rooted in the deep and old things, the ancient things of the world, which are more true and have life to them. And I think this is a perfect kind of it's a scintillation of what this Tolkien's poem is about. Is the kind of actually life comes from returning to this source of the older myths, whereas kind of abandoning tradition, abandoning those kind of cultural moorings is a dusty path. which leads to just a blandness, which we see all around us today.
Just building apart from that, because I do have a little segment sometimes on these shows. I go through whole articles. I think that's going to be virtually impossible here, given what we want to achieve. So I've increased the scope of extracts and narrowed them down. So the next little segment I have here is from On Fairy Stories, and again talking about not just the relationship, the value of myth and the idea of a sub-creator. I have another section after this by Lisa Contrast, and the idea of Tolkien's relationship with Logos. But it's about again, when Tolkien was in this academic atmosphere, he was faced with this division, aggressive division between English lang and English lit. And again, to Tolkien, and we talk about his conception with the Kalevala, which you brought up, Mr. Patriarch. To him, this notion is inseparable, and this may serve actually as a point against the idea that this is a genuine mythology of England when we get to the last sort of section of this conversation. But here we go on fairy stories. Mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near the truth to say that language, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. But language cannot all the same be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongues and the tail are, in our world, coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things and finding it fair to look upon, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation and fairy is more potent, and that is not surprising. Such incantations might indeed be said to be only another view of adjectives, a part of speech in mythical grammar. The mind that thought of light, heavy, grey, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic. That would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn grey, lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into a swift river. If it could be if it could do the one, it could do the other. It inevitably did both. When we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire to wield the power in the world of external to our mind awakes. It does not follow that we shall use the power well upon the plane. We may be greedy upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine, or we may cause woods to spring up and silver leaves, and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of a cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made, fairy begins, man becomes a sub-creator. And I brought this up not only obviously emphasizing the power of literature to become a form of truth in and of itself, and the power of alliteration, because of course Tolkien wrote in verse, and he wrote in various languages as well. He would sometimes not only write in Anglo-Saxon but deliver lectures in Anglo-Saxon, and of course we have his advanced languages, or Gnomish or Elvish, depending on what stage we're talking about, Sindarin and Quenya. But this notion of man becomes sub-creator is important to me, because again, it's the fundamental friction that one is again talking about received tradition, and yet at the same time, man has become master of his own universe, and this sort of informs us sort of going on to the idea of logos. But just before I get onto that segment, any thoughts?
I think so. There's a good connection to be made here with George MacDonald, who was he's arguably one of the originators of the fantasy tradition in the 19th century, and was read vociferously by Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And MacDonald has this idea in one of his essays. I think it's called "On the Imagination," or The Imagination. He discusses that actually, fundamentally, God's creative act, the creation of the world, begins in God's imagination, and as a consequence, all things that have been created first began as God's imaginings. And I guess this will play into a couple of weeks as well. But then, as a consequence, human imagination, it differs in kind, because God's imagination is from nothing. It is just pure creativity, pure imagination, whereas ours is drawn from the world. But in our own imagination, we are participating in God's imagination. We are ourselves beings who have been imagined by God to imagine certain things. So, for example, he gives the example of God imagined Hamlet, so he brought into being Shakespeare to bring into being Hamlet. So there's this idea of bringing to fruition God's imaginative capacity already in MacDonald, and I think we see the same in Tolkien. And he's not as explicit in some ways, but when he says things like, "I have," in his letter to Milton Waldman, that there's a givenness to the stories. They kind of arose within me. There was no kind of forethought. It was just there. There's that sort of sense there.
Well, that's almost the explicit connection, the anecdotal connection Tolkien gives about the story of Arendelle. The story of Arendelle comes, and a friend asks him, "What is it?" And Tolkien's response is, "I don't know yet. We'll find out."
Mm.
But you've wonderfully, Nathan, you've wonderfully anticipated this next section regarding the relationship with creation, Christian creation, and myth. The book I have here in front of me is the Theology of Beauty by Lisa Kutras, and I feel sorry in a way, because when I would like to sort of recommend all of these books to everyone, but as is often the case with Tolkien studies, the works of Tolkien are sort of bought and incredibly popular, but things written on Tolkien considerably less so. So this is as inaccessible to get as any sort of lofty academic tome could possibly be, again indicating that because of that, that's one little indicator that Tolkien studies is again a real academic discipline, the inaccessibility of the various texts to the layman. But nevertheless, it's quite a good summary, or rather sort of embellishment on that point you brought up, Nathan. This mythopoeic poetic observation, the notion, the similarity between logos and Tolkien's version of subcreation. The coupling of light and word is central to a Christian theology of creation, and likewise central to Tolkien's creative imagination. Verlyn Flieger, who has an article on the matter of Britain, which I've linked in the description, has demonstrated the etymological relationship of light and language in Tolkien's creative imagination, a connection which links both concepts to a primordial logos. As Flieger suggests, the relationship of logos and light is paramount for Tolkien, for these concepts frame and permeate the whole of his created world. She argues that this notion of subcreation draws precisely on the logos. Specifically, this is the logos of the word, found in the Gospel of John, which reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all the people." The Gospel writer here echoes the Genesis account of creation, describing God's creative word of power in Greek terminology, while the Gospel writer has primarily drawing upon the theological traditions of Hellenic Judaism, and do interrupt me whenever you want to interject. It is worth recounting the Greek tradition of the Logos, for Tolkien would have been aware of the etymological and historical roots of Logos and its place in Greek thought and literature, of course, philologist, philologia, love of words. Throughout its history, the concept of Logos revolved around the idea of rationality. Broadly speaking, its meaning functioned on two levels. The first referred to the ordering, law, or mathematical rationality of the cosmos, and the other represented the rational capacity of the human being. Regarding the human being, the logos was the inner law of reason, the nous, the law of being that distinguished humans from other creatures. In particular, it referred to rational discourse, making the connection between speech and mind. The logos was spoken utterance of reason. Tolkien's familiarity with this concept is suggested when he refers to the incarnate mind, the tongue. Alongside the concept of rationality, logos was often connected to the imagery of light, whether it be the primary element of fire in the material universe or the light of reason involved in the utterance of speech. Given that the logos was the law that governs reality, as well as the law of reason within a human being, the logos was considered the connecting principle between humankind and the cosmos. This view holds that an inner law of a human being, reason, derives from the cosmic law of creation, mathematical order. By the cosmic logos, the human logos expresses rationality. It is therefore by and within the cosmic logos that humankind exists, communicates, and experiences the world. For the Greek, the logos was the law of order and rationality that governed the universe. For the early Christian in a Jewish context, the logos was the utterance of the wisdom of God that brought the cosmos into being, ordering it and sustaining it. Against this implicit backdrop, Tolkien makes his case for subcreativity. He refers to the storyteller who uses language as an instrument of meaning, demonstrating the power of words to create. Just as God has made with the word, so also humankind creates with words. His phraseology is noteworthy. He writes, "We make by the law in which we are made." In analysing Tolkien's use of light and word, Verlyn Flieger persuasively concludes that this law is the word, the logos, and I think I'll leave it there. Any points to make? Because, of course, they're both sort of indications. One, that the sub-creator is in some way some sort of sub-god, so to speak, in terms of the actual creation. But of course, this idea of the logos as referring to a cosmological order within Tolkien's own work, as I alluded to in that reading I did last week, this was a notion that was, it was a constant state of difficulty, Tolkien having to reconcile his cosmological view and make it, coincide and consistent with his entire framework. But of course, there is again the idea that referencing logos, light, law of reason, this eternal order, that this is a recurring theme throughout the entire Silmarillion. So any sort of developing points upon that?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I was taking down notes as you were reading. There's a lot in there. So coupling of light and words intrinsic to the Christian idea of creation, law of the cosmos, rationality of the humans and the logos. So first off, there's a word that you use there, the nous. And this concept of the nous, I believe, is mostly, it may sort of still exist in the West, but as far as I understand it, it's predominantly a phenomenon within Orthodox theology, actually. And the nous, I believe spelled N-O-U-S, is basically can be understood as analogous to the eye of the soul. So the eye of the soul is the means by which humanity is able to sort of perceive the spiritual world and sort of interact with or be made aware of God's sort of divine energies. Oh, sorry, my boy's making noise in the background. Now, sort of the connection of humanity to the transcendent is through its connection with the logos. So again, in the Christian sort of traditional worldview, God sort of acts from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. And of course, the manifestation of God on earth is the Logos, Christ, who sort of, spoke creation into being. And now the sort of sub-creativity of humans, sort of humans as sub-creators, in which we are able to an extent, participate in the creative aspect of, let's say the divine. This is interesting because this is also, again, somewhat mirrored in Christian theology as well. So, again, in sort of Orthodox Christianity, you have this notion of theosis, by which man sort of becomes deified and like sort of small gods. Now, it doesn't mean like, in Mormonism that we become God of sort of our own planet and whatnot, but basically theosis is the process by which we sort of become like Christ. And sort of within the relating to sort of what Tolkien's talking about and stuff. I'm sorry about my son, guys. I'm going to call my wife. Hold on a second.
Whilst we wait for Nathan, for Mr. Patriarch Nathan, is there anything you would like to say?
I guess on the flip side of that, if the loss of mythology or of legends sustained by language results in the diminishing of human nature, insofar as it means that you've lost your function that mirrors God, as it were, and you've lost your connection to God in the process. So I think it has cosmological and ethical and eschatological implications for Tolkien.
Well, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, one notion that we've been referencing a lot on this channel is the idea of subversion, discord in harmony, and desacralization. You could say resacralization, and the idea of the word and the word itself being corrupted, that meaning being corrupted. I mean, we're almost living through that today, ongoing. But of course, that's sort of going off into a different conversation. But especially in Tolkien, the idea of that is explicit. But Mr. Patriarch, you're back. So would you like to continue your very insightful point?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry about that. But anyway, so what was I talking about? So theosis, theosis is sort of the process by which humanity sort of becomes more like God. So now, if we apply this sort of within the concept of, bring this sort of high altitude Christian sort of traditional perspective and sort of apply it to Tolkien as sort of a creator, I think we can definitely see there's this impetus to sort of by opening sort of the noose, sort of the eye of the soul, and being willing to sort of participate in sort of, again, sort of the divine energies and whatnot, and fall in sort of alignment in sort of our place, we are able to sort of act as sort of participants in sort of bringing, sort of the word into being, so to speak. So humanity has the capacity to sort of act sort of on its own, but at the same time bringing forth something that's sort of more profound, right? So, and that sort of goes back to this idea of myth making and sort of what Tolkien's talking about. So it's sort of it's a way by which we're not exactly aping the divine, but we kind of are at the same time, without sort of being sacrilegious or anything, or sort of trying to make something of our own in the place of the divine. But we are, in effect, sort of telling sort of part of the grander story through myth making.
Yes, it's glorification of God as opposed to attempting to usurp God, and I think that's tangentially that's a wonderful link for when we get to talking about the Ainu Lindale, because that's obviously the central theme of that. But just getting back here, because again that's a wonderful tangent we can go down, but we can't sort of sadly go down that many tangents. Kutras continues. Human beings, as part of a created reality, make, by, and within this law. David Lyle Jeffrey notes that this approach to subcreation is thoroughly medieval. Words are modelled after the logos. For the medieval writer, writing was always an analogous activity, a repetition in history of patterns first translated in creation, he writes. Words contain in themselves expressive meaning, drawn from the depths of being, for words are the embodiment of concepts extracted from reality. Kreeft echoes Heidegger, suggesting that real things are found in words, for words are encompassing the frame of the world of things. Humankind perceives and interprets reality through language, for reality is framed by the logos of God. For Tolkien, humankind makes with words because they are made by the word. He writes, "We make in our measure and in our derivative mode, because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image of likeness of the Maker. Humankind is made in the law of the Logos, as well as the image of the Logos. While all creation has indeed been made by the creative word of God, humankind is unique, and that they are fashioned in God's image and likeness, endowing them with imagination and creativity that mirrors the divine mind." Michael Milburn draws attention to Tolkien's description of fairy as the use of tapping of the underlying powers of nature. The powers of fairies are inherent powers of the created world, deriving more directly from the creating will of God. So anything to that's the end of the passage. Anything to say on that?
I guess I would just throw in, I think there is an Enlightenment twist on this, though, that I see in Tolkien, insofar as if we think of Kant's revolution of epistemology and the idea that everything we apprehend is through various categories, so time and space, and so everything we're perceiving involves an act of imagination. And this gets taken up by the romantics like Novalis, who would argue that imagination is the primary activity of human beings. And so when we come to Tolkien, I think he's adapting that in some way, because his point of view does have roots in earlier traditions, but it does seem he's emphasizing a particular imaginative, creative act as the primary way of glorifying God, at least in a literary mode.
Well, that's a perfect sort of analogy. Because when I was reading this, I was thinking about Kant's concept of the sublime. So I think wedded into this, there are sort of Enlightenment elements and this epistemological framework, which is thoroughly understanding this greater meaning beyond just our sensory perceptions. Mr. Patriarch.
I'll leave it there. Nothing to add. I'm just mulling it over again, sort of in that passage, just sort of the connection to the Logos. So humankind makes with words because he is made through the word. We're made in the kind and manner of the Logos. So creation for humanity is merely a reflection of his nature, which is reflected in the divine. So no, I thought that was an interesting point. Again, I'm good on Nathan for bringing up the Enlightenment connections. But yeah, I'm just sort of thinking about this in sort of a more spiritual context.
No, absolutely. I think before we get on to the next segments I have, which will really get into the historicity, but of course all of this is interrelated, so we will obviously be coming back to this topic. I just want to refer back to the point I made right at the beginning, which was about the golden ages of Greco-Roman mythology and relating to this. So we have creation, we have received tradition, and these elements, especially the aspect of creation, are going to be explicit in our conversation next time. But just as we're on this topic, obviously the reading I gave was on the creation of the Silmarillion and the various incarnations of the Silmarillion. Obviously, the difficulty that Tolkien faced throughout his nearly sort of over 40-year-old period of writing the Silmarillion. I mean, if we start with Arendelle and end in 1959, we can say that this process took about 45 years and was never completed to satisfaction. You can say the first Silmarillion we have, which was completed by about the early 1920s, which is the Book of Lost Tales. The Book of Lost Tales starts with the chapter, The Cottage of Lost Play, which is essentially referred to as the framing chapter. In that chapter, Ariel the mariner visits Tolkien, and he visits the land of the fairies. And this is essentially the Temple of Law, with which Ariel, again linking this back to a mythology of England. I have a little segment here. This is the commentaries on this chapter by Christopher Tolkien in the Histories of Middle-earth. So it's page 22. I haven't referenced History of Middle-earth in the notes because it's going to be essentially it's the Bible for this series. It's the central text, and when it comes to formulating specific chronologies, I will be going over which segments I've used for the sake of clarity. But just for now, I'm using the commentaries in the Cottage of Lost Play, and again this is explicitly relating back to this idea of was Tolkien ultimately trying to create a mythology and a mythology for England.
Just to say before you read it, for the audience, if you're looking for copies of it, you can get it on Zed Library for free, so you don't need to pay for a copy.
Absolutely, though I would recommend for any serious Tolkien fan to get a copy. They are lovely, and they are sort of almost a necessity if you want to pursue this topic further. But yes, you can access almost anything we produced online. Funnily enough, not my Tolkien's Legendarium book, which I was using for last week, but the vast majority of this stuff you can access online. The story of Ariel the mariner, and this is Christopher Tolkien speaking, central to my father's original conception of the mythology. In those days, as he recounted long after in a letter to his friend Milton Waldman, the primary intention of his work was to satisfy his desire for a specifically and recognizably English literature of faerie. I was from early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no story of its own, bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality that I sought and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands. There was Greek and Celtic and Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian, and Finnish, which greatly affected me, but nothing English, save impoverished chapbook stuff. In the earliest writings, the mythology was anchored in the ancient legendary history of England, and more than that, it was peculiarly associated with certain places in England. Ariel himself, close kin of a famous figure in the legends of northwestern Europe, came at last on voyage westward over the ocean to Tollesia, the lonely isle, where elves dwelt, and from then he learnt the lost tales of elfiness. But his role was at first to be more important than the structure of the work, than what afterwards came simply that of a man of later days, who came to the land of the fairies, and then inquired lost or hidden knowledge, which he afterwards reported in his own tongue. At first, Ariel was to be an important element in the fairy history itself, to witness the ruin of the elvish Tollesia. The element of ancient English history, or historic legend, was at first not merely a framework isolated from the great tale that afterwards constitutes the Silmarillion, but an integral part of their ending. The elucidation of all this, so far as elucidation is possible, must necessarily be postponed to the end. And again, getting that there's another section here. Later, his name changed to Elfriend, and I've heard numerous pronunciations of that, but for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to use Elfwine. The mariner became an Englishman of the Anglo-Saxon period of English history, who sailed west over the sea to Tollesia. He sailed from England out into the Atlantic Ocean, and from this later conception comes the very remarkable story of Elfwine of England, which will be given at the end of Lost Tales, and again that is the second part of the Book of Lost Tales. But in the earliest conception, he was not an Englishman of England. England, in the sense of the land of the English, did not yet exist, for the cardinal fact, made quite explicit in the excellent notes of this conception, is that the elvish isle to which Ariel came was England. That is to say, Tollesia would become England, the land of the English at the end of the story. Coromas, or Cortiterion, the town at the centre of Tollesia, to which Ariel comes in the Cottage of Lost Play, will become in effect the days of become in after days Warwick. Cor, War were etymologically connected. Alaminor, the lands of elms, would become Warwickshire, and Tavrobel, where Ariel sojourned for a while in Tollesia, would afterwards be Staffordshire, a village at the Great Haywood. So there are some explicit sort of geographical elements in there. That's just a hint of it. But the reason I wanted to bring that up, because that obviously brings up two things connecting this to, is this work a connection of English history? Obviously there we have one framing device, which is the Ariel and later Elfwine, the Anglo-Saxon mariner encountering Tollesia. Various versions, of course, have it either an island to the west of England, you could say almost like an Avalon, or ultimately becomes England itself. So we, for example, have the Great Fairing, and we have the Shattering of Valeriand. So the notion of England as not only being, connected to the story by that framing device, but also being part of the geography, i.e., this is a mythology in which England comes into being, is quite explicit at the beginning. However, as I was elucidating in that tale, in that essay on the Silmarillion, Tolkien goes through various iterations of this, and towards the end, we have various sources. So, for example, Elfwine receives this from Rumil, the lawmaster, who also is the author of the Aina Lindale and the Ambakatana, which is the notes on the great cosmology, and then very much later, we have this idea of time travel inserted into Lord of the Rings, connecting this back. And this is the idea of, the Lost Road, where C.S. Lewis was given the idea of, doing a space trilogy, and Tolkien had to do a time travel story. This was never finished, and later evolved into the Notion Club papers. And this again is where we have Numenor inserted into this, and we have elements such as reincarnation. However, all of these elements don't necessarily stick. Numenor sticks, and it becomes part of a later tradition which forms the basis of the late Second Age. But this explicit connection to England, these ideas of, traveling through dreams, these ideas of alternate states of reality, the idea of the cosmology of the world changing, the idea of the world beginning as flat and becoming round, and also explicit connections and geography connecting to England become less precise. And I think the nail in the coffin to this idea connects back to the creation of the Hobbit, because as people who've seen the other content on this channel will know, the Hobbit was essentially an accident. It was the publisher finding a copy, suggesting it should be published, and afterwards then we have the pursuit of a sequel to the Hobbit. The Silmarillion is offered as a possible solution among many other works. All of them were rejected, and so Tolkien instead works on Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings establishes the central part of Tolkien's mythology, at least to readers and people who are aware of Tolkien, as the third age and not the first age, which was the central point of the original conception. And as a result of that, Tolkien sort of goes around a new framing device, which is the story, the Red Book of Westmarch, which is a collection of stories authored by Bilbo, sort of soaking up the lore of Rivendell, and that itself is a connection to the Red Book of Hergest, which was a compendium of the matter of Britain, composed in Welsh around the time that Geoffrey Chaucer was writing. But why am I sort of mentioning all this? Because in addition to that, we also have Pengelod and the Golden Book, also called the Parma Culina. There are several elements that this informs. First of all, how much is Tolkien straying away from this idea of creating a mythology of England, and essentially what does he want his books to be? Because in essence, what the Red Book of Westmarch is, it's a conceit. It's a device to allow for the telling of the story within the story, and it gives a character with insider knowledge a conception of the greater lore. Because the more you move away from this idea of mediation, from the idea that there is an established history within universe, or that this history in some way connects to something which is real, like for example Tolleresia and this mariner from the early days of Wessex, later England, the more you stray into this idea that it is a fantasy history. So even with the idea of the Red Book of Westmarch, you have already sort of adopted this idea that Bilbo within universe is the primary sort of originator or relayer of the story, and even that in the end that device was dropped. I saw one lecture beforehand, one by a Dr. Corin Olsen, who suggested that the history of Middle Earth, at least the beginning of history of Middle Earth, the forward, where Christopher Tolkien talks about the process of adapting and editing the Book of Lost Tales, was some form of atonement for the fact that he had decided to opt out of a mediation device for the Silmarillion, thus confine it to this almost the state of as essentially a work of fantasy, but not just a work of fantasy without a central sort of story narrative going throughout the entirety of it, and therefore it's almost in that way constructed as a lore book. These many elements sort of detract from the idea of an English mythology to speak, but it brings into a notion, another idea, this idea of a received tradition. That what Tolkien is doing, he is not necessarily, again, this is why talking about the edited Silmarillion is so much more difficult when relaying it to what Tolkien's actual intentions were, because when you get to the edited Silmarillion, it does appear like a fantasy novel. Without this mediation. But if you take into account all of these different authors, all of these different provenances, all of these different stories as a collection, what Tolkien is essentially relaying is this idea of some form of received tradition, that all of these works have a provenance, they have an author, they were written by a person who has some form of association, whether it be Elven, whether it be Númenórean, and they're all forming and contributing to this thing called the matter of Middle-earth. Sorry, Mr. Patriarch has fled. Obviously, I've been rambling far too much, but I think he had to go now at this point anyway. So sadly, he couldn't say goodbye. Hopefully, he'll be back to say goodbye. But yes, I think that's probably a cue for me to stop speaking and to allow someone else to speak.
No, that's really helpful context, I think, because it's such the developments of the Ariel character and then its dropping is so important to understanding why many people don't know about it. I think I think I would add a couple of things to your really helpful analysis. I think one thing is just understanding perhaps an influence on the Ariel story is Thomas the Rhymer, and this was a very popular kind of legend in medieval England, and Thomas the Rhymer famously was Eildon Tree, and was taken away by the queen, the elf queen, to the land of the fairies, where he stayed for a number of years and returned to England, but with the gift of prophecy. And so there's this kind of legend already, and Ariel kind of fits that model. He goes into the land of the elves, he learns the stories, and in due course returns and is I guess is the one who relays these stories to the world. So there's a similarity there. I do think though that I can see why it was dropped, because I think by Tolkien's own understanding of the fairy story, it does produce a problem, and dare I say it, of Tolkien. And if I may, AM, I was just going to read a short passage from On Fairy Stories, which I think helps elucidate the possible issue with it.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, so it comes about halfway in, and he's discussing whether fairy stories are meant for children. And he writes, "Children are capable, of course, of literary belief, when the story maker's art is good enough to produce it. That state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from the outside." And I think this gets to potentially the heart of the matter, insofar as by the Ariel story or Elfwine story connects the Silmarillion and later stories to the real world, the primary world. And this causes disjunction, because we recognize that the laws of those worlds are not reflected in our own, and it causes, I think, some disbelief or awkwardness. So by removing it, although it makes it a work of fantasy, it avoids the possibility of disbelief arising from these stories, unless he wants you to believe they're genuinely true, which raises other issues, I suppose, as well.
Could I bring up a meta point here? Because that's a very interesting point. In Tolkien's defense, I will add that he was completely aware of this, and of course he wrote about this. But later,
Yes.
in terms of self-awareness, he was desperately trying to deal with the idea of cosmology. Because on the one hand, you have the central. Again, this links back to our tridentine discussion. On the one hand, you have the cosmology, which is relayed around the Earth, the centrality of the Earth and all the events happening in the Earth, and then you have to combine it with the notion of almost universal infinity, and as a result, the comparative insignificance of the Ainur and the Valar and everything happening in Middle Earth. But then you have the notion, for example, of the flat Earth, which then becomes the round Earth. Tolkien attempts to get around this. With the idea of the Notion Club papers, i.e., there are degrees of reality. You're intersecting into something which is essentially not just a different time, but a different form of reality, a different form of a sort of physical world. But as you mentioned, I think in terms of connecting that and making that believable, that believability, especially in the time he's writing, I think almost Tolkien, is a modern writer in the sense that he has created what we see as the modern fantasy genre. But when linking this back to something like a Kalevala, a Lonroot-esque work, look at the context in which they're writing. Lonroot is writing this, Elias Lonroot is writing this at the beginning of the 19th century. Finland has just, of course, Lonroot, Kalevala, Finnish mythology. Finland has just switched hands from Sweden to the Russian Empire. And as we see with Sibelius, Russian nationalism is very strong during the period in which Finland was a grand duchy under the Russian Empire. Finland has seldom in the last 1,000 years had a tradition of independence and statehood. And into this climate, we're also talking about the era of Romanticism after the Enlightenment, the counter-Enlightenment, so to speak. In that sense, Longroot is fulfilling a desperate need among that people. He's intellectually consistent with the writers of that time, but he's providing them, like the Brothers Grimm in Germany, with essentially a national epic, which not only serves as a source of sort of inner orientation for the idea of being Finnish, but it is again almost a political tool used in opposition to the Swedish and of course the Russians who are occupying in that time. So in that case, it becomes a matter of political as well as literary significance. The time that Tolkien's writing, the idea of Little England is almost, again, this is encapsulated in Tolkien's worldview and to an extent in Tolkien's work. This idea of a realistic sort of mythical conception of England, which is assailed by all these forces. You could write some sort of trite comparison maybe to the Second World War, which obviously that allusion you can draw into to the idea of the Lord of the Rings, but obviously the analogy falls flat. So I think Tolkien, in that sense, is a victim of his time in the fact that he's also writing at a time where secularism is far more pronounced. The Finland in which Longroot was writing was fundamentally Christian, but also fundamentally nationalistic. Now, Christianity, even Catholicism at this time, he lamented the fact in his later life he was witnessing Vatican II, and he very much sort of irked and was frustrated with the new order of mass, which he went to for the last 3 years of his life. All of these changes are happening around him, and the tide is fundamentally against this idea of realizing some sort of mythology for England, so to speak. And of course, his publishers are well aware of this, that they resolutely sort of refuse to publish this. And I think the only way that Tolkien could have published this in any sort of form is by relying on another framing device, using the Red Book of Westmarch and relaying this back, through essentially the view of the hobbits. One thing he opined about, as to why the Silmarillion wouldn't work, is the fundamental lack of hobbits and the fundamental emphasis on the story on the elves in the First Age, which are hobbitless. So that's one possibility, that instead of omitting any sort of mediation whatsoever, he would tie it into the hobbits. But in that case, you again suffer from this idea of linking this back to English mythology, and taking an example which I used at the beginning, which is the matter of Rome, linking this to Troy. The desecration of one world, and again you can draw in Troy, one sort of connection with the fall of Gondolin, and of course the fall of Numenor. All of these elements are there, but I think in terms of the context that Tolkien was writing, the believability isn't there, the demand wasn't there. And I think had such a work been produced, it would have been baffling. Indeed, the Silmarillion, as it was rather baffling to many people who watched it, who read it, expecting something in the vein of Lord of the Rings. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I definitely think it's fair, and that kind of the necessity of historicity in that respect really shone through in your answer. I guess perhaps another way to think about it, and I hesitate to use the word allegory because I think Tolkien famously said he did not like allegory, but I do think that there is a possible allegory with Tolkien and Ariel himself, in terms of Ariel. Well, he's described as a wanderer of the seas. Well, the famous Saxon poem of the Wanderer is a man who's lost his traditions, lost his land, lost his community, and is reminiscing of this. Ariel arrives in the Lonely Island and receives these great myths from the elves. And Tolkien is a bit like that himself. He's somebody who knows the classics. He knows Homer. He knows the Volsunga Saga. He knows the Kevlar. He knows the Arthurian legends. And these things have all been lost in modernity, in modern British society, and had no real purchase upon society. I think Stanley Hauerwas has a good line where he says, we're a people who have a tradition, which is not having a tradition, which is, of course, inconsistent, but it's this idea we've lost that. And Tolkien himself, through the Silmarillion through these other texts, quite like the singer in the Kalevala, sorry, is reciting these. It's got a new form, it's got a new kind of composition, but he's bringing these things back and thus giving life back to England through its lost traditions.
And the bard I think you're referring to is the old bard,
Yes.
Väinämöinen. I know there is a Finnish watcher of this channel who will rebuke me for every single pronunciation. I think you can see that to some extent in the tales of Tom Bombadil. Bombadil in some cases has transcended that, and when I had Rachel Fulton Brown on, she again elucidated this idea of the magical idea of relaying stories. I think Tom Bombadil is the best possible sort of relation to that, and of course contained within the conceit that is the Red Book of Westmarch, there are, in addition to all of the stories and the elven translations by Bilbo, which would have consisted of the Silmarillion. There is, of course, the tale of Tom Bombadil, but as again, other than the segment we have in the Fellowship of the Ring and the book, the tale, is again relaying this back to how central really Tom Bombadil is in this mythology. Of course, he is the eldest, and he is immune to the power of the ring. But frankly, I don't know enough about Tom Bombadil to be able to relay this back to his centrality within the story, and indeed as a framing device, as some sort of old bard relaying the story of old England. Because again, that explicit reference, I think, is implied, but again, it's implicit rather than explicit.
Yeah, it's not fully worked out, and I think anybody would have a hard time working out the history of England from Tom Bombadil's songs.
Yes, yeah, precisely. So again, this is getting into all of the weird sort of inconsistencies, idiosyncrasies with the Silmarillion. The fact it is an incompleted work, the fact that it's a work almost beyond the acceptability and the taste of the time, and again this notion of fashion, taste. Tolkien has been derided as pining for childish nostalgia, childish escapism, tradition, outmoded means of thought. All of these things, all of these accusations have been given to Tolkien. But I think again there is this consistent trend of yes, there is lost, declining tradition. I think there's one framing device which I need to mention. I mentioned Ovid. There is a more recent example which you can bring into this, who again thought in stages of high culture and decline, and indeed ages. And that is Oswald Spengler. His conception, of course, was Apollonian, the civilization spurred on by ancient Greece and Rome. And then we have the Magian civilizations, which are, again, almost, epitomized, or sort of cavernous civilizations which are built, aping the traditions of the Apollonian culture. You can again relate this back to golden and silver ages. And then we have the Faustian age, which basically encompasses the era of Western Europe from the Holy Roman Empire onwards. And this link, again, obviously the Faustian Pact, making a deal with the devil, it's this general sort of intellectual dissatisfaction with everything that one finds around one. And again, turning away from, the Apollonian culture, which is very self-satisfied, or at least in Spengler's view, towards this, constant yearning, this constant thirst for knowledge. And again, one could also link that intention explicit in Tolkien, when one looks to the Númenóreans, who were given the island of Númenor in the sight of Valinor, and yet they were sort of corrupted by Anatar Sauron to give way, to make this pact, to abandon their traditions and to pine after, unlimited power, eternal life, etc. And of course, it was ultimately their downfall. So I think that is possibly a fair assessment. You may disagree with me on that, but there you are.
I guess I would just throw in just very quickly, is that I think what's coming through is for Tolkien, you need to be engaging creatively with the myths of not just of your own country, but just the great myths. And I think that's a call to all of us, actually, in our own ways to start thinking about that. How can we actively engage with the Iliad or the Volsunga Saga or Shakespeare, for example, in creative work in our own context?
Right. This moves on. I think we've managed somehow to compartmentalize this, because now we're drawing on the inspirations and the literary nature of the creation. So this is a segment from the Matthew Bardowell article, which is the Finnish article, which I would recommend everyone read first because it's by far the most informative. I've also included an article on Tolkien's Catholicism and imagination. There are elements in that which go into tradition, but the author makes a lot of progressive steelmen, and rightly sort of rebuffs them. But again, I feel that it's a complicated work. There are elements in it which are positive, but there is a lot of chaff within that article, which is why I haven't included it in the set reading. But anyway, onto the Bardowell article. Given Tolkien's proclivity for drawing inspiration from other narratives, it is not difficult to understand why tracing the original sources of inspiration for his work has proved a favored enterprise among his critics. In the experience of this Tolkien reader, the results at first are thrilling. This is the power of literary illusion. Those who understand it feel as though they have gained direct access to the intentions and thought processes of the author. Based on Tolkien's own comments about the nature of influence, however, we have reason to believe that he understood his utilization of these various sources as something far different from literary illusion. While no critic should be circumscribed by Tolkien's particular idea regarding influence, an aesthetic reckoning of his work would do well to consider it. Just as Tolkien was not loath to admit when elements of his work were influenced by foreign sources, neither was he shy about stating his thoughts about the nature of literary influence. In his seminal biography, Humphrey Carpenter records Tolkien explaining his creative process for Lord of the Rings. It grows like a seed in the dark, out of the leaf mould of the mind, of all that has been seen or thought or read, that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps rather. No doubt there is much selection, as with a gardener, what one throws on one's personal compost heap. Specifically, Tolkien is referring to the linguistic nature of his creation. But beyond this, he provides us with a striking metaphor and a more appropriate way to embark upon the search for origins. If we understand that many things Tolkien read and admired are but pieces that comprise a great literary compost heap, we can adopt a view that further complicates his creative process. What he does is not coarse borrowing, ostentatious illusion, or ideological slavery. It is fertilization. These materials are not stripped from their original context and sloppily transplanted in some new creation. On the contrary, these older sources nourish the new, and the seed germinates and grows infused with the qualities of the soil in which it was planted. With this, in his landmark, sorry, there's a little disconnect here. In his landmark essay on fairy stories, Tolkien posits that for story or subcreation to engender belief, it must convey to the reader an inner consistency of reality, relaying back to your point, Nathan. One of the many ways Tolkien achieves this inner consistency is to construct these creative moments around specific principles or ethics that assure their legitimacy within Tolkien's poiesis, a term Tolkien employed himself that combines the ideas of creation, making, and of speaking poetry. So any thoughts on that comment? I think that's a very sort of succinct summary of, when, for example, because we've done a dedicated 2 entire streams to going into the various influences, but none of us have basically accused him of just narrowly adopting and plagiarizing anything, but rather transforming this. And I think this idea of a fertilizing compost heap growing out of the leaf mold of the mind is quite a useful analogy in terms of conceiving Tolkien's thought process, quite in opposition to George R. R. Martin's very misplaced understanding of Tolkien as an architect rather than a gardener.
Definitely, and if you think of Tolkien's story Leaf by Niggle, where the painter Niggle ends up having to create a garden, and Tolkien saw himself in that story as akin to Niggle as a gardener, and I guess it also corresponds to the we mentioned earlier that there's a certain unconscious level to this, and that these ideas just arose. He didn't know where they came from necessarily all the time. That it was more he had soaked up a lot of these sources, and then from there ideas sprung, or illusions, or pictures almost. I guess that's a good way to see it. You can see pictures that resonate with various mythologies, but are not identical. As you say, fertilization, or maybe sanctification might be a word we want to include if we go back to what Patriarch was talking about how the creative act is a participation in God's creative act, or is therefore a means of theosis?
Well, I think again that's probably a beautiful and poetic way of describing. You can say the conception of Catholic art, everything from Tolkien to Caravaggio and before. And I think in terms of that employing some element of the work, we have theosis, and on the other hand we have poiesis. We have the greatest sort of moral elucidation, eucatastrophe and everything to do with that, and this idea of eru iluvatar, and this idea of harmony and concord, and truth, and linking everything back to the will of the creator, and being in opposition to discord and disunity. All of these elements permeate throughout Tolkien's work. Yes, absolutely. The next segment I have is by Michael Livingston. This is the Trojan Article, which again is an explicit element of this these compound, essentially the various illusions, influences you can have. But this is interesting in two ways, essentially in that it is, you can say, be part of the Tolkien matter, the matter of Middle Earth, the influence behind it. But this again is linking this back explicitly to a English mythology for reasons that we'll go into. When talking about this cumulative Trojan hypermyth, this is just one of several compound layers that resonate beneath the literary surface of Tolkien's complex work. Just as there are multiple worms that undergird Tolkien's construction of Smaug, Wayne G. Hammond and Christina Skoll, for instance. Tolkien was always careful to term his mythology as one that is ultimately meant to be associated with our world, fantastic though it may seem at times there is a story long ago. He writes in the foreword to The Hobbit, not we should note a story of long ago in a galaxy far, far away, or the like. Thus, Middle-earth's legends are connected to our legends, its languages to our languages, and its people to our people, if all at a distance deep in the fictional mists before recorded history. This is not to say that Tolkien thought that the Battle of Helm's Deep truly occurred somewhere in, say, Eastern Europe, but that something like the assault of the Hornburg could have occurred there, and perhaps that something like it ought to have occurred there. Middle-earth, in other words, is the result of the application of philological principles, finding words behind words, stories behind stories to mythology. Tom Shippey has elsewhere termed the resulting mythology behind mythologies an asterisk reality, a provocative phrasing that underscores the philological foundations of Tolkien's creative process. This non-extant words, whose existence is rooted out by linguistic laws, are typically preceded by asterisks to mark their invention as missing links in the evolutionary chain of language, and there are many elements compounding there. So we start off from the idea that certain myths are part of these compound layers that resonate beneath the literary surface of Tolkien's work. That's one thing, directly connecting with the previous article. But talking about this idea of a Trojan hypermyth, the mystical origins of Britain, this is again linking a myth within a mythological framework. We talk about the matter of Britain, etc. Well, one of the etymologies of Britain is Brutii, from Brutus, not Brutus of the Roman Republic, and of course the Brutus who slew Julius Caesar, but the Brutus who fled the city of Troy and nominally founded England. And this was something which was understood implicitly by a vast sort of section of people right up until, you can say, the late early modern period. This idea that the origins of England were Trojan, that London could almost be said to be a new Troy. The various instances talking about asterisk creation, so we're talking asterisk reality again, we're talking about philology again. A large part of if you, for example, study the formations of very early Neolithic languages, we've covered this briefly on this channel, especially when we talk about Greece. When you're looking at early sort of Indo-European civilization, when finding words, you would tend to create words, or philologists tend to create words, which follow in the various structures in which successive words emulate. Essentially, they take elements from that and they create what is known as an asterisk word. Well, now we're talking about asterisk history, that is to say history reconstructed based on something that ought to happen. But here we're not talking specifically about history, we're talking about mythology and history combined. And the examples that Michael Livingston uses are examples such as Faramir being an asterisk Paris, or Boromir being an asterisk Hector. So within the compound layers of all these literary illusions, which none of them again are slavishly adhered to and can constrain in either way, This, interestingly enough, relates to this idea of mythology for England. That if you relate it back to this Trojan hypermyth, and these figures are in any way, stand-ins for various, creative characters found in other myths, then we can build upon this and say that if these illusions, stand up, then there is, something incredibly rich here. And of course, Verlyn Flieger talks about this, and the idea of a matter of Middle Earth is distinct from the matter of France, the matter of Rome, the matter of Britain. But there are things you can add to this, because Nathan, you were discussing with me in private, there is another connection that one can draw in terms of this Asterix history, which is relating back to my earlier point about the Roman mythology, which is the link one can draw with the Trojan hypermyth, which is supposed to be a myth again pertaining to a sort of pre-myth of England, and that is of course the flight of Aeneas and the founding of Rome. And one can draw, two links in Tolkien's work. One, of course, is the fall of Numenor with Elendil, and the other, of course, is the fall of Gondolin. So, I mean, just little elements there. And again, talking about the idea that something like the assault on the Hornburg could have occurred. Well, this is linking back to our earlier stream, where we were talking about the various allusions one can draw, for example, with Minas Ithil, Minas Morgul, being the city of the moon, Constantinople, and Minas Tirith, Minas Anor being the equivalent stand-in of Vienna. And we talk about the idea of, the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Well, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, you can say, is some form of Asterix iteration, of something that could have happened, combining the 1453 siege of Constantinople with the 1683 siege of Vienna. But again, I've talked too long. So Nathan, are there any points you want to sort of bring into that?
I was just thinking as you were speaking about something Semiagog had said on, I think, his last stream, where he was making this argument that writing precedes speech, and he based this on the fact that animals, in some way or another, seem to write on the landscape. They mark their territory, and so this becomes an essential feature of, I guess, political identity, is being able to write and thus define the boundaries of your identity versus another. And whether or not then this idea that kind of Asterix mythology or mythology is kind of the foundation of history in some way, in terms of a mythology marking out one's identity as opposed to another, it sets in place those various contours. And so, okay, in a literal sense, Britain wasn't founded by Brutus, or England, I should say. But that idea as a marker of who the English were and their kind of who their friends and who their enemies are might be even more significant. And so in that sense, it does breathe life into that identity.
Just to, I've got several pictures up. I just want to sort of explain how these sort of make up part of the mythology. So here I've got King Arthur. And again, I find this interesting looking at these ancient medieval attributed arms to King Arthur, which does so happen to contribute to the royal arms of Sweden. Just a little thing I noted. This idea of Swedish history being, some sort of, inheritor of the Arthurian legend. But nevertheless, Arthur, and the whole nature of the Arthurian legend has a large sort of influence on the Book of Lost Tales, but specifically one can draw the allusion with him and Aragon. When we're talking about the fall of Atlantis, Numenor is probably almost the closest thing you have to an obvious allegory, without much differentiation in terms of a literary or influence, because of course the fall of Atlantis isn't a historical event. It is it is an illusion created by Plato to indicate something that may have happened. And some sort of historians, archaeologists have linked this back to maybe it could have involved a Carthaginian settlement on the beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the common sort of assumed place. Actually, no, it's the explicit place mentioned by Plato. This would have been a Carthaginian settlement based around the modern Spanish city of Cadiz. Here we have an image of the Curse of Culliver, of course. One of the main early inspirations for Tolkien and Turambar, and of course this is Aeneas fleeing the city of Troy. just to emphasize all of that. But yes, bringing back it to the points you mentioned about mythology being a demarcator, essentially, of a branding, essentially, of what we are and what we aren't, a state of otherness. If we can't explicitly say that Tolkien was writing a mythology for England, then we can definitely say that Tolkien had sympathy with the idea, especially very early on, with the idea of writing a mythology for England, and that even though it wouldn't form a literal history in the sense that these were facts to be, proven empirically, this was very much something in which the English could mark themselves and differentiate themselves from a history which is, again, imbued with. I mean, just look at the early case of English history. We have the Romano-British. Of course, the British later essentially become Gaelic elements in the Welsh. So we have that legacy, and of course that legacy is bound up with the matter of Britain. But of course, the matter of Britain is also mainly sort of authored by French writers. Much of the early history of medieval England is written in Anglo-Norman, essentially a proto-form of modern French. And then we have, of course, the matter of France, which of course goes around the reign of Charlemagne. We talk about the Song of Roland, which again is another influence. I think the Song of Roland is almost an explicit connection to the death of Boromir, which this author Michael Livingston does admit and bring up. All of these elements sort of exist, but of course, what is Tolkien feel? He wants this yearning to create a demarcation, a marker of being English, as opposed to deriving from all of these other influences, which is why he's so interested in authors such as Chaucer, why he writes, and sort of talks in Anglo-Saxon, and why he focuses on poems such as Beowulf. It is this idea of recapturing this notion, this ancient sort of Westeron history of what it is to be English, but nevertheless, as we see, Tolkien doesn't exactly achieve in that. I think the nature of what the actual sort of impact result of that is that we have a fantasy which almost is universal in scope.
Mhm.
It isn't written for the English, and so this idea of a original point of demarcation arriving from this Trojan hypermyth becoming this English myth is almost lost in the result and becomes this fantasy marker which is universally received.
Well, you could reframe it. I think you could say he's writing a mythology for the reactionary, perhaps, in terms of he develops a set of legends which resonate with those who reject modernity and could be seen as demarcators. The fact we could achieve a Tolkien day is probably emblematic of this. And if you tie this into the fact that there are various movements now trying to deconstruct and subvert what Tolkien wrote in order to support a new set of identities in opposition, it's a destruction of the marker of one of the markers of the reactionary, perhaps. So maybe that would be a way to interpret it. It doesn't have that geographical focus, but maybe it's reflecting something else or a certain group within England in his period.
Well, I think one of the fascinating things about Tolkien himself is that he was, in many ways, a consummate outsider, in the fact that he comes from this this Prussian family of clockmakers and piano makers. His father goes off to South Africa and dies out there. His mother converts to Catholicism in opposition with all the family, and he's brought up by Father Francis in the Birmingham Oratory. I think in that sense, Tolkien is fascinating in the fact that he is so strange. He is so disconnected from, you could say, the continuous sort of strand of English history. I mean, I know when formulating a historiography for the fact that I'm just Catholic alone, in addition to all of these other things which I don't have compared to Tolkien. I know that this has been difficult. This has been a point of sort of demarcation again from the prevailing currents of English history. So I think, again, this is why you could almost say the pre-Reformation period is an aspect of English history which appeals to Tolkien so much, and even earlier history, the primordial nature of what it is to be English history. And we're talking about this universal sort of manual for a reactionary. I'm not sure whether there's anything sort of that explicitly political in terms of the actual sort of basis for the work that would ascribe to that. But I'll be interested to hear you flesh that out, a little bit more. Obviously, implicitly, the entire work is reactionary, but in terms of a reactionary political piece in earnest, I'm not sure.
Well, I guess I'm just thinking of the Scouring of the Shire here in particular, as a we discussed it at length, so I won't go into it fully. But it's just this idea of rejecting modernity and actually restoring England to what it ought to be through the recovery of its traditions and kind of the natural order. That seems to be a very strong theme in Tolkien's.
But that is again where I bring in the Spenglerian pessimism into Tolkien, because we're talking about the Four Ages and what this work is supposed to be. To my mind, there is an element of tradition which is lost. There are aspects which are recovered, but again, with the creation of the the original Titanomachy, we have Kronos. Before then, we have Ouranos. Then we have the rebellion of these sons of Kronos, led by Zeus, the Titanomachy. The Titans are dispossessed. Some of them, like Prometheus, form an alliance with Zeus, but by and large, they have been usurped, and there is a new caste of gods. The gods then create man, and the story then moves essentially onto man. And again, it follows a similar motif to what we have with Tolkien, albeit Eru Ilúvatar is a central figure, unlike Ouranos, who is usurped and castrated in the actual sort of story, in contrast to Eru Ilúvatar. But bringing this on, we're talking about the ages. So we talk about the first part, the Ainulindale, the Valaquenta, before the entering of the Ainur into Arda, after which they become the Valar. Then we have the departure from Middengard. And again, in terms of understanding the nature of it, Middengard is something that Tolkien would have received very early on from his reading in Crist. Middengard, the Middle Earth, literally means the land, the plain between hell and heaven. Within the cosmology, in addition to Eru Ilúvatar, there is a literal physical heaven in the work of Lord of the Rings, that is, and the Silmarillion, that is expressed in Valinor, which is under the control of Manwë. So we have all of these elements, but again, it's you can interpret that as degeneration. We have the elves departing towards Valinor. We have the Númenóreans, declining in age. All of these great gifts that have been given, all of this is an area of decline. And you can say that the fourth age, the eucatastrophe, which permeates through Lord of the Rings, and is that moment of exhilaration when all is lost. Then the ring is destroyed. Minas Tirith is delivered by the Rohirrim, etc., and then the army of the dead. All of these things are great sort of triumphs. Nevertheless, we already had the kingdom of Arnor, we already had the kingdom of Gondor. And I mentioned another stream I was on with Semiagog, where we discussed the idea of a restoration, where in every iteration it seems where, you say, for example, talk about the Holy Roman Empire, or you talk about Restoration France after the French Revolution, there is always some concession to the forces which assailed it in the first place. There was always some depreciation, degradation, which encompasses it. And so one could interpret, had we had a fully realized fourth age, whether it would have been the Iron Age rather than the gold, the silver, and the Bronze Age that we see before, a world just permeated by men without any supernatural influence whatsoever, the elves having departed, and seeing this creation of the world as we know it, the world where mythology ends and we enter into a period known as history.
And I mean, this is a very Platonic idea, the idea that every change is a change away from the perfect or the good. But I guess I would kind of caveat that with the fact that it seems that with the kind of decline of each of these things, or the kind of final decline of each thing, so the elves need to leave Middle Earth so that the race of men can have their age. And there is that kind of idea throughout, and I wonder as well if that has its roots in the story of Ragnarok, where the destruction of the gods allows for the undead to burst forth anew in the new creation, and you see this even with the way that the destruction of each age or the end of each age leads to a recreation of the world in
Mm.
some way or another. So I totally take the point that there's always a sense of loss with these things. So the restoration of the Shire, it's never the same again, and Frodo has to leave Middle Earth in the end. But there is a sense as well that there needs to be a waning of certain things for other things to grow as well.
I think the overarching point, because we're talking about motifs within the Silmarillion. The Christian motif is very obvious. Obviously, you have the redemption of mankind through Christ, and then you have the Book of the Apocalypse or the Book of Revelations. It is tragic, yet also it is triumphant.
Mhm.
The fact I think the Silmarillion doesn't have that explicitly. The fact that there is no sort of aspect of Eru Ilúvatar himself, which comes and redeems the creation, so to speak. Again, I think Tolkien would have balked at this idea because it would have been almost a explicit Christian allusion. But I think within the Christian conception, the tragic vision of mankind is combined with that. And I think that is perhaps something which is lacking from the overall mythos, this idea of universal redemption through Christ. But I might be completely out of line by saying that.
Well, I think you're right to an extent, but I would argue somebody like Erendil probably comes quite close to that, and indeed Erendil manages to call forth Ilúvatar's action, or the Valar's action, I should say. So and that leads to redemption and the overthrow of Morgoth.
Mm.
So there is that motif there, but not as strong, because obviously after that there's still decline, right? So
Yes.
yes. Mhm.
Yes, I think, again, in terms of my own characterization of Tolkien, there seems, again, referring to this to the ages and using Ovid as quite a good example of this. With the first age, again, there is the beginning, there is the creation, there is the decline, there is the reprieve, and then there is more decline, another reprieve, more decline, and then another reprieve, as opposed to something as dramatic as and completely totalizing as, say, for example, the coming of Christ on earth, so to speak, to redeem all of humanity. But anyway, that's going into theology rather than the scope for this conversation, but it's a thought nevertheless. Now, the next article, well, rather it's a recurring aspect of this previous article I mentioned on the on Finnish, the Finnish nature of the work of the Silmarillion by Matthew Bardowell. And this is explicitly going into this idea of the Kalevala. And if we have time, I'll link this back to a revisionist article which tries to disprove the entire notion that this work was a work of English mythology. Verlyn Flieger asserts that Tolkien envisioned himself doing exactly what Lonrut did, and this is what I alluded to earlier, constructing a world of magic and mystery, creating a heroic age that, although it might never have existed, will give England a sartorial sense of its own mythic identity. Anne Petty extends the notion, arguing for a connection of lore may also have nourished his creative ethos. The difference between creative through remembering and creation by invention is subtle and easy to miss. Even the Oxford English Dictionary is ambiguous about the meaning of the word invent. In the same entry, it calls inventing both to come upon, discover, find out, to devise, and contrive, which reflects the dual nature of the Latin root. And this is quite a long extract, Nathan, so if you do want to butt in, I really do advise you to do so.
Sure.
C.S. Lewis may help to ground this distinction. In The Abolition of Man, he explains this duality as the clash between an advance and an innovation. An advance is moving from the Confucian, do not do to others what you would not do, like them do to you, to the Christian, do as you would be done by. An example of innovation is something like Nietzsche's morality. That is, an advance can only be established when it honors the old maxim, whereas innovation can only be accepted if we are ready to scrap traditional morals as a mere error. This illustration may prove useful in understanding the conflict between Wainamoinen and, again, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Joukahainen. The old bard has uncovered the old wisdom and honors it by building upon it. The young lad rejects the ancient knowledge in favor of something new or invented. When he prevaricates while singing about origins, he creates an invention. Wainamoinen, on the other hand, remembers, recovers, and retrieves the matter of his songs. In addition to
just at this point, I think it would be worth just saying that we've just been discussing that decline is the motif, and here we have Lewis saying it's advance or innovation, which is quite an interesting
Oh,
counterpoint.
if I wasn't explicit, I think decline in innovation to be more or less synonymous. Progress and decline, one and the same.
Fair enough. But advance then, is advance the right term? I just throw that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to informing instances of creation in his legendarium, Tolkien's personal creative ethos also reflects it. And I think that's a fundamental difference between the left and the right, where the right sees decline, the left sees progress. Remembering is exactly what Tolkien believes he does as he composes mythology. In his often cited letter to Milton Waldman, and I do advise you all read that, Tolkien writes that the ideas for his mythology arose in his mind as given things. In the true spirit of remembrance, he follows this by claiming he always had the sense of recording what was already there, something, not of inventing. Further, in his lecture on myth-making on fairy stories, Tolkien offers his most fully formed account on the art of subcreation, and again this is relating to that passage I mentioned earlier, which is an act of remembering or uncovering what is already there in order to build upon it. In order to subcreate, one must first notice what exists in the primary world. Thus, true subcreation will have its roots in what already is and has been from ancient times. Later in the lecture, Tolkien includes a segment of his poem Mythopoeic, in which he discusses the role and right of a subcreator. Tolkien explains that though humans are fallen, they still retain their image of God. The subcreator is the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues. Thus the myth maker creates because he is made in the image of a creator. Tolkien believed deeply in the derivative nature of just creation. In other words, his personal creative ethic was in accordance with the values of the Kalevala. His stories are, in a sense, recited. He believed that they were gifts and not mere inventions. The creative art for Tolkien is an uncovering remembering, rather than the desire for something new apart from the deep origins. Finally, in order to understand the antithesis of this kind of creation, we take up a character whose very name means contriver, Saruman. Shippey uncovers that Tolkien derives Saruman's name from Old English seru, which means cunning or skillful. He postulates that Tolkien may have chosen this route because he wanted to associate Saruman with mechanical ingenuity. One can see evidence of these characteristics when Gandalf meets Saruman before becoming fully aware of his treachery. Saruman shows his ambition when he rejects his colour in the Order of Wizards. Gandalf notices that Saruman's once white robes are now woven of all colours. When Gandalf questions him about this, he sneers, "White serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed, the white page may be overwritten, and the white light can be broken." Saruman has opened his mind to an entirely foreign form of creation, one that rejects the old wisdom in favour of his own. He expresses the ambition to create apart from the natural order of things. Treebeard corroborates this verdict when he says that Saruman has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things, except as far as they serve him for the moment. The machine in Tolkien's world is an ominous force and often employed to denote a conflict between nature and personal will. Certainly, this rejection of ancient and established ways in favour of the new applies to Saruman. To sate his selfish ambition, Saruman continuously fells trees to feed the fires of Orthanc. Treebeard laments there is always a smoke rising from Isengard these days. Saruman shows a disregard for these old beings. His only interest is in devouring and making things of his own devising. Through the dichotomy of remembrance versus innovation versus invention, the Kalevala offers a creative principle that governs creation in Tolkien's world. True creations are remembered, not invented. In the example above, Saruman resembles Youkahainen in this type of creation, a creation that is not rooted in any ancient thing. Thus, one can liken Saruman's various creations to singing without reciting. Now, you've done a whole stream on this subject, so you should be able to bring some perspective into this, Nathan. Not to put you to put you under any sort of stress or anything.
No problem. I think what you can see there is that, well, the example of Saruman's a really helpful one because he attempts to usurp the natural order by taking power which is not his to have. He wants to rule the world in order to his designs, which is, of course, only that of Eru Iluvatar. Only he has the right to do that. And in so doing, he, even if for a good intention initially, which is the opposition of Sauron, he succumbs in the process. And I think this this really helps to enliven what that means in terms of the natural order, because what's being argued here is that it's not just kind of relations of power, it's also your attitude towards received wisdom or the culture or the customs of your people, and acknowledging your place in relation to that. Where somebody like Saruman throws it all out, burns it essentially, just as he hacks down the forest of Fangorn. And is what's replacing it is just domination, pure and simple. Do you have any thoughts, Zayn?
Yes, no, absolutely. I just want to chime and reiterate all of these thoughts you have mentioned, and the fact that is what is replaced is just the pure will to power, pure domination. There is no creativity. There is no substance of the logos which is created. There is this no idea that this is a form of subcreation, that this is something, again, following in the path of the will of Eru Ilúvatar. Because it should be noted that, Saruman within the scheme of things is a Maiar, or a lesser Maiar. He's one of the lesser Ainur, one of these supreme sort of sublime beings who are above the created beings of the elves and men, etc., who have come to guide humanity and all the races of Middle Earth in the correct way. He's also the leader of the White Council, so he subverts that role, which again is one of a guide, not a domineering force. And this is quite an interesting link. So we're going to cover this more when we get into the lore proper. But of course, we have Melkor, who begins this. Melkor, whose name is obliterated, and then becomes Morgoth. Morgoth, of course, entices the if I remember, Ossi, the essentially the sub god under which is the god of the sea, the Poseidon equivalent. I've forgotten the precise moment. Ulmo, yes, that's the one. And Ossi is essentially always flipping from essentially he's the violent personification of the sea. Which is essentially becomes amoral. He's not really trusted by anyone. But Sauron, he is a servant of Aule. He is the servant of the fine crafts. Aule is, of course, also the creator of the dwarves. The dwarves were created so they could appreciate the crafts of Aule. So Saruman is invested in creating and contriving these things, and he is drawn to the power of Melkor. Saruman, in the similar vein, is drawn to this idea of hidden knowledge, and so again is drawn to this idea, again, the Faustian idea of Spengler's, which is the desire for eternal knowledge, this intellectual dissatisfaction, this drawing towards eternity, this rejecting things of the past, rejecting things remembered, brings one into the state of decline and corruption.
It's interesting too, because if you contrast Saruman with some of the heroes, I know we're talking about Lord of the Rings here, but I think that's helpful just as a kind of ground basis for this. Many of the heroes in the story enjoy singing great songs of renown. I think of Aragorn singing the lay of Beren and Lúthien, or Frodo Baggins has a great knowledge and love of singing, and even Samwise Gamgee creates his own song in this way. And they also consider what myths might be made. Samwise the Brave, for example. So they have a reverence for these customs and traditions in a way that the evil characters don't. And that's quite revealing.
What I love about that, again, that's a wonderful anticipation, because the next segment here is on the Finnish poetic tradition. And this is the last bit I'll get to before we get to our final article. One of the primary themes within the Finnish poetic tradition is the power of words. The ancient Finns valued storytellers, and their stories hold power that physically manifests itself. Before any story begins, the poet of the Kalevala provides an opening justification through which we begin to understand the aesthetic value of the Finnish people. The opening lines of the Kalevala convey the notion that the power of song derives its force from the land. These mysteries have been snatched from the roadside, plucked from the heather, torn from the brushwood, tugged from the saplings, rubbed from the grasshead, ripped from the footpath. The poet whose work composes the Kalevala considered nature as their teacher, and their source of music. The cold told a tale to me. The rain suggested poems. Another tale of the winds brought. The sea billows drove. The birds added words. The treetops phrases. The poetic ethic of the Kalevala is to understand song and story as something uncovered or recovered from nature. So again, it's the fact that all of these characters you mentioned are singing, and Tom Bombadil, of course, is this greatest example. So it's not only that they're singing there in reverence to this, the inherited stories, but that these stories have a hidden power which is in some way uncovering some sort of deeper truth from nature.
And just to develop on that, Tolkien argues on fairy stories that the fairy, or the realm of the fairy, is nature itself. And this is the primary medium or instrument in which the fantasy genre focuses. So magic is just a development of nature. And so this connection of this kind of story is connected with nature is in itself a strong link for him.
Absolutely. There's just one point which I'll end off, which is quite a nice summary of Tolkien's own intentions before we get on to Mythology from Lincoln. So this is an excerpt from the Waldman letter. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, and again, this is on the Silmarillion, ranging from the large and the cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story. The larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, my country. I would draw some of these great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. So I think, again, that's quite a nice summary of all of the sort of elements we've been discussing, but also the idea that this is part of a received tradition, and that perhaps, again, maybe he was anticipating his own death and his own mortality at this point, because this was in 1951. He would have been around 60 at this point, and close to resigning his professorship. And of course, he would cease or work on the Silmarillion 8 years later. But nevertheless, I think already right from the beginning, right from 1912 through to the 1920s, there is this idea that, again, we talk about this knowledge which is received, this knowledge which just comes into be. We've talked about all these various literary allusions, and Tolkien would emphasize that these are applicable to his work, but they are not allegories. This is not authorial intent shining through and trying to force the work into a certain cast of interpretation. Rather, all of these things are open. And there's a bit of a thing which I'm breaking, which is one of Giambattista's rules for historians, which is never essentially always position your own thoughts, your own intelligence, on your own conception of the author or the historical subject, and assign to them all of these wonderful intentions, because seldom do they ever exist. But it's something I do admit I do commit, and I do break that rule often. But nevertheless, as we can see in terms of the intention, if we are to weave and to dedicate something to England, and again wrap all these tales together, and again create this majestic whole, all I can say is that it's a tragedy, certainly for us who are talking about the subject today, that we can never see Tolkien's entire creation realized as he would have intended. Nevertheless, I'm not sure whether that would have been possible, especially considering that towards the end of his life, Christopher Tolkien probably inherited a less coherent work than Tolkien had already, more or less completed with the Book of Lost Tales in the early 1920s. So there you are.
If I may, could I just make a kind of a back step just for a second before we move to the final point, which is that this idea of Saruman as an originator or original thought. Now, Tolkien was working in academia, and for any of you who've been in academia for any length of time, you'll know that I think in the last century, there was a shift from scholars who, for much of their life, did not publish very much, but were just able to lecture, and then at the end of their lives, they would produce one great magnum opus, perhaps. Also, it's something akin to that. There wasn't this demand to publish constantly, whereas today, by contrast, there's a constant need to be producing articles all the time. You need to have something original to say in every article, And if not, then that's a big problem. And we see this is symptomatic of society in general, that actually everything has to be novel and new and original. Nothing could just be building on what's gone before. It has to make a new landmark. And I imagine Tolkien was probably responding to that context, not just in general, but in his own academic context too. So he's not just rebuking the idea that fantasy or mythology is a good thing. He's actually arguing the very people arguing against this have the wrong standards too in their academic discipline.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I remember reading a Guardian article once a long time ago,
Oh dear.
suggesting that yes, suggesting that Lord of the Rings and this silly work on his mythology was simply a distraction from what should have been Tolkien's main academic work. He should have just stuck to being an academic and kept away from this. And of course, what I found funny about reading that article, and why you're no doubt laughing, is that the two are absolutely interconnected. One can't separate one from the other. But nevertheless, yes, it's this idea of output and novelty and the volume of output, which of course is leading to that wonderfully sort of monstrous Tolkien summer seminar put out by the Tolkien Society. You can actually all watch all of those seminars. They put them on their YouTube channel. I do find it rather funny that my YouTube channel has more subs than the Tolkien Society YouTube channel. So it's likely that this video is probably going to have, I'm not doing this to sound vain, but just a point of amusement, it's probably hopefully going to have more influence than some of the more controversial titles that came out of that seminar.
Well, and in a meta sense as well, like what you're doing with this series, and you've already done not just with Tolkien but with history as well. You are doing the same practice in many ways. You're trying to recover those lost histories and traditions and mythologies for the modern audience. So we've got a lot to be thankful to you, AM.
I think you're putting me too much on a pedestal there, Nathan.
I'm doing
yes.
what you do to Tolkien. I'm seeing all these things in you.
well, again, it was just to complement your point, where if you want the if you want the fruits of what Nathan is talking about in terms of the state of modern academia, check out the Tolkien Society YouTube channel. Anyway, now there is a relatively short article. I might skip over bits. It's 5 pages, but it's quite small text. I'll actually zoom in a bit so I can actually read this. It's called it's an article by Anders Stenström, and it's called A Mythology for England ? And this is quite an old article. It was written in the late 1990s. So this was about a year before the publication of the final volume of A History of Middle-earth. And there's something to note. When we did our original inspirations for Tolkien, a part of that was, essentially all of it, was relying on Tom Shippey's Road to Middle-earth as the bedrock for that conversation, and then we would glean and make whatever original points we wanted to on that conversation. Sorry, something stuck in my throat. But it should be noted that it's quite an old work. It came out before most of the volumes of the History of Middle-earth were actually published, and Shippey actually acknowledged this, and again points in The Author of a Century, his more recent book, that is a detriment to his work. So one of the elements in that, of course, is his talking about the linguistics of Tolkien, how he was obsessed with East Germanic, but of course when going to the Node article, which was written 20 years later, Node makes the opposite contention, that Tolkien's obsession with East Germanic was relatively over by the time of his mid-20s, and he'd actually become recently obsessed with Finnish. But that's one note, that we've added a lot of far more recent extracts of Tolkien studies, writings, etc., to inform our conversation here. And our original bedrock was found in Tom Shippey. Tom Shippey, it should be noted, is still very much respected, and I love all of Tom Shippey's writings. But as is often the case, I mean, this is what I like about this. This is real sort of historical updates, i.e., Christopher Tolkien releases a new version of a new book with original material. Now we all have to update our thinking. This isn't academic history having to move via consensus. This is Tolkien studies having to move because Christopher Tolkien has released a new hitherto unknown piece of information, which is how sort of real sort of academic history should progress. Alas, that really is more controversial to point that out nowadays. But anyway, getting onto this article. It is well known that J.R. Tolkien said that he wanted to make a mythology for England. Well known, but not true. This paper investigates how Tolkien really used the word mythology and also look at its relationship with England. For many years, it has been a received truth that Tolkien wanted to make, or was initially, a mythology for England, a phrase which is always put within quotation marks and never provided with a source. As far as I have found, the true tale runs in J.R. Tolkien, a biography by Humphrey Carpenter in 1977, wrote of the young Tolkien's appreciation of the Kalevala, quoting wish for something of the same sort belonged to the English, and commented perhaps he was already thinking of creating that mythology of England for himself. And of course, do interject whenever you want. Evidently satisfied with his phrase, Carpenter titled part 3 of his book, 1970 to 1925, The Making of a Mythology, and opened it with stating Tolkien's desire to create a mythology for England, and thus it chanced that the phrase found its way into the biographer's index, where under Tolkien, John Ronald Reuel, you find writings, principal books, starting with the Silmarillion, which is a secondary entry, a mythology for England, within single quotation marks in the original. Like the names from Tolkien's works, and the one actual quotation out of the leaf mould of the mind to be found in the index, this is where the quotation marks come from. In context, the desirable something of the same sort refers to the very primitive undergrowth found in these mythological ballads, the Kalevala. This doesn't explicitly equate mythology, though it might be difficult to find one word equivalent. It is more curious that in later passages, Carpenter supports his statement with a long quotation from the Waldman letter, where the original project described by Tolkien is not to make a mythology for England, but to make a body more or less connected legend to be dedicated to England, to my country. And I can't help but tell that this is actually incredibly pedantic.
Definitely. And just on that point, I think Christopher Tolkien in the commentary to the Cottage of Lost Play.
Yes, this is the first thing you'll read when you get the history of Middle Earth. There was a long forward where Christopher Tolkien goes into this at length. But yes, anyway, go forward.
Well, he just says, he doesn't use the term a mythology for England. He says a legendarium for England.
Yes,
so, which would immediately get round this author's objection to Carpenter.
Well, it's not just Carpenter at the moment. I also referenced another work which came out around the same time, Tolkien's Art and Mythology for England by Jane Chance, which also became very popular. And the fact that Christopher Tolkien, if anyone is going to be an authority on Ronald Tolkien, it's going to be Christopher Tolkien. And I think this is something I regret not including when I did that very brief introduction to the works of Tolkien, which is how to read the Silmarillion, which is to read the Silmarillion from the peak of Lord of the Rings and look back on the creation. Essentially, when you look at how to read, what the Silmarillion is, what the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are, they are works which are very much informed by it would have been 30 to 40 years worth of lore construction done by Tolkien up until that point. And therefore, it is a wonderful entry into the vast scope of history, which is the Silmarillion, this mythology for England in quotation marks. And Christopher Tolkien's own suggestion is to read it from that perspective, read going back as opposed to read forward, which again is why I advocated in that little video to never read it before, never read the Silmarillion before, because it might actually, in my view, perhaps put you off the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit as well if you have no sort of interaction with it whatsoever. But that is again quite a good introduction into the mindset of the entire construction process of the Silmarillion, because there are so many iterations, not just the one that was published in 1977, which is probably the only one most people have encountered. Like the quotation marks, the spurious connection has fixed itself in the mind of Tolkien studies. During my search for the source of the quotation, I was repeatedly and unhesitatingly referring to the Waldman letter. At last, I have now found a probable derivation. There are a number of places where Tolkien uses mythology about his own work, and in one of them he is not far from a mythology for England. One of the letters begins like this: "Thank you very much for your kind and encouraging letter. Having set myself a task, the arrogance of which I fully recognise and trembled at, being precisely to restore to the English an epic tradition and present them with a mythology of their own, it is a wonderful thing to be told that I have succeeded, at least with those who have still the undarkened heart and mind. The published text is a draft for a letter to be to an unidentified Mr. Thompson. So Carpenter probably saw it while he worked on the biography and associated with the something that belonged to the English from Tolkien's Kalevala paper and the dedication to the England to England from the Waldman letter. These clearly express comparable thoughts, but the author actually spoke of different things. In the earliest instance, it was the fruitful primitive undergrowth in language and tradition. In the second instance, his own projected legendarium and the successful mythology. In the Thompson letter was the Lord of the Rings or elements of the Lord of the Rings, as of the words being precisely in the quotation above seem to show. It was Mr. Thompson who had called it that, and that Tolkien, while accepting the term. Anything to say so far as I'm reading this?
I guess I just think the author here is a typical modern academic who's trying to find something to be original about, whereas they're trying to be too sharply in, like, did Tolkien say this? Whereas actually, I think over the course of this discussion, we've seen that he never said it explicitly, but it's very implicit in almost every facet that there is some kind of he regarded it as some form of mythology, and it was in some way addressing England in particular.
Well, I think I'm just, I'll read a couple more pages of this, then I'll stop.
Sure.
Then I'll probably read the conclusion, because there's a point here which he's missed, which I think is much more devastating for this idea of a mythology for England. But I'll get into that, which he hasn't alluded to. The word mythology certainly is capable of a wide sweep of meanings. Used broadly, it may mean nothing more specific than a body of stories, epic corpus, etc. The author, for instance, employs this meaning in his footnote to letter number 211, paragraph 13, where our mythological Middle Ages means the Middle Ages as they are in our stories. A little further on the same letter, he mentions the new and fascinating semi-scientific mythology of the prehistoric, using the word in a related broad sense, a conceptual construction with imaginative power. Obviously, Tolkien has indeed created a mythology in both these senses, and obviously the phrase "a mythology for England" seems to say something more specific and significant, and has commonly been taken to do so. At the same time, though many critics have piously spoken the password, it has not been awarded insight, though it might make an introduction or conclusion more evocative. The truth is, of course, a mythology, in a more specific sense than those mentioned, is not what Tolkien's oeuvre is, and not what he set out to make. There is both mythology and a mythology. In the Book of Lost Tales, but itself is neither mythology nor a mythology, if mythology is used in its central current sense, involving such notions as primordial, the cosmic, the divine, the sacred, the patterns for life, society, and nature. A painting of a tree may be too large to extend to consist of painted sky, but this does not make it a painting of the sky. There is a distinction between the subject matter and the background. In the Book of Lost Tales, the mythology forms a background that might come in everywhere, like the sky glimpses beyond the leaves. Again, I can't think of anything sort of more pedantic than that. In the same way that, for example, writing about Jason and the Argonauts wouldn't be some sort of mythological writing, but rather it would be a story with mythological background.
Yeah, it's twisting the conventional meaning for a technical one, I guess.
Critics, thoughtful and philological, have associated the presupposed desire to create a mythology for England with the many instances where Tolkien in his stories reconstructed a context for ancient English or Northern mythological fragments. Arundel is the most prominent case. In his article in the recent Arda, one such philologist, Shippey, accordingly observed how Tolkien contrived to fit in all the bits and pieces which philologists during the 19th and 20th century had uncovered from the English stories, which would have made a mythology for England, if only it had not all got lost. Explicating, Tolkien was trying to reach back to an old past, as it were, the lost English equivalent of what had almost survived in Norse. He was looking back to try and find what we might call an Asterix mythology. The observation is true, but the explication only gets hold of what Tolkien was doing when he reconstructed, not what Tolkien was doing. The painting may be using ochres, but that is not what he is doing. He is painting his tree. If every concerned element down to the last repercussion of the Edda, of the mythological vestiges in English words and names and so on, in the Book of Lost Tales were listed, we would still only get a list of scattered points, by which the cycle as it would be could not be comprehended. Important though some of the elements are, reconstruction is incidental to the work. Also, the reconstructive efforts embrace not only mythological fragments like Arundel and Wade, the man in the moon might perhaps pass as mythological, and not the nursery rhyme porridge served to him. It could have been reconstructed as mythology, but was not. What the author was concerned to cultivate the remnants of was not mythology, but the whole primitive undergrowth of tradition and language, ranging from the serious to the curious. So what do you make of that in particular?
I think there's 2 points there. I think on the one hand, yes, Tolkien's trying to recover tradition and language, but it seems to be traditions and languages connected to certain legends and mythological texts. It's not just any tradition. So I think that's an important point. But second, the author seems to, or the scholar here seems to suppose that the story itself, in its narrative structure, isn't also recovering something. And as we know from On Fairy Stories, Tolkien believed that his story was recovering or presenting the gospel or the narrative of the gospel, and indeed all great fairy stories do that in his view. So recovery is at the heart then of the very narrative of the story.
Most obviously, the Asterix mythology view fails in that neither the Lost Tales in general, nor their mythology in a special, can sincerely be regarded as very like anything that might have been told among the ancient English. Tolkien's legends are, even in their earlier stages, undisguisedly idiosyncratic. And I will not be persuaded that this is the result of a glorious failure, that the author in fact strove to reproduce the lost English mythology as he conceived it to have been. There is a further difficulty which encumbers the idea of making a mythology for England, reconstruction or not. It may be less obvious, but was lucidly exposed by Shippey I quote summarily. So if Tolkien thought he was going to make a mythology for England, this meant trying to give people something which was so evidently missing that they would not believe it if you gave it to them. So I think that the public acceptance would never have been very likely. I think Tolkien knew that. He tried a line of descent in English. He tried borrowing also from Norse. Neither of these, I think, would have been successful tactics. In other words, could Tolkien have ever thought that the English would accept his writings as their mythology? This is in effect a 4 in Carpenter's formula. I think that is a more persuasive argument. The idea that I think even the notion of explicitly labeling it a mythology for England and trying to sell it as such would have been mentioned as ridicule by authors at the time, and I think there would have been some sort of, again, note for sort of a usurpation or again pure invention. I mentioned the Longroot comparison and the fact that the historical context really yearned for something like the epic romances which come out of the Kalevala, which again is part of this ancient received tradition. I think even though Tolkien was very much, I mean, he even conceived of his works as epic romances, I do very much feel that after having produced The Hobbit and having produced Lord of the Rings, I do think it would have almost met with ridicule the idea that you turn around and say, I mean, even though it should be said that some people do take this as seriously as mythology in terms of their understanding of the law, that this was supposed to be in some way a definitive mythology for England. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair, and we have spoken about how Tolkien himself acknowledged that if you wanted to say it's true in a historical sense, it's in a secondary plane. The Ariel story at the very least. So even the strongest evidence would seem to support what you're saying. But that at the same time, we spoke earlier about how mythologies are the basis for identity, and whether or not those mythologies are literally true, whether or not there is truth, they convey a deeper truth about a group's identity. Could it be a mythology in that respect?
But also, I mean, even if that's true, even if Tolkien believed that it wouldn't sell, or that the idea would have been silly and unfashionable, that doesn't preclude it from being so. In terms of summarizing this, because there are some other points, but I think the central point, which I want to bring up, is something which he alludes to briefly, which is the idea of language. We're talking about, and this is, I'm bringing in my own critique. when we talk about the idea of language, because of course Tolkien was a philologist and he was a creator of languages, he talks about this extensively on A Secret Vice. He not only appreciates languages, language making for the sake of language making, but he's an aesthete when it comes to his language creation. He prefers languages which are phonetically beautiful. He is drawn to languages, as we mentioned, such as Finnish and such as Welsh. When he's drawn to the Kalevala, he's drawn to it as much for the language as he's much drawn to it because of the actual the scope of the mythology. So what I think undermines this notion of an explicit mythology of England is that Tolkien, as we all know, is completely capable of writing in and reconstructing things in ancient Anglo-Saxon or anything sort of predating ancient Anglo-Saxon. And we have that allusion in Christ to a language which is almost, again, a primordial form, which is Saxon before Saxon, so to speak. However, when Tolkien talks about his, the constructed languages, what are the two constructed languages which really sort of come out? They are the Gnomish languages. They are the languages of the of Sindarin and of Quenya. Even if you link this explicitly to Welsh and say that the principal influence on these languages is Celtic, and therefore you can say there is something of the primordial sort of ancestor civilization, the Welsh civilization commingling with the English civilization that later comes upon this. Within the strict languages that we see, especially in the Third Age. The Third Age is a better example of this when we talk about men. Numenorian as a language, and again, I'm going to pronounce it Andunaic, around the river Anduin, is not a recreation of an ancient form of English language. There are some Semitic roots to that. And when we talk about, the two sort of English tongues within that world, we are talking about Rohirric, and we are talking about the rather anachronistic, what Shippey calls it, Shire. So what I find rather novel about this is that as we come closer to something which can almost be a stand-in for English mythology, the closest example which Shippey talks about is the idea of Rohan. Rohan being etymologically linked to the idea of Horsa, because there is this etymological link. The founder of the Anglo-Saxon nation, Hengist and Horsa, Horsa's etymology means horse. So the whole idea of being Anglo-Saxon has to be reconstructed based on that etymology. So we come up with the Rohirrim, which at times they are both Mercian of the mark, and yet they are also, and so embodying this mention of this idea that Christopher Tolkien brought up earlier in his commentaries on the Cottage of Lost Play, which is the idea that Tolerancia is supposed to in some way harken back to this idea of Warwickshire. However, there is also this connection to East Germanic civilization, which again we talked about, Nathan, on our previous conversation, again examining Shippey in detail. So what I find fascinating is that if we have some sort of reconstruction of an English mythology based upon the idea of the Rohirric, and then we have this anachronistic mythology of the English based on the Shire, based on this country idyll which was being uprooted by the forces of modernity. And we see the dystopian example of that in the Scouring of the Shire. We see the fact that these shirelings have a political system which is based on, the idea of a shire which predates the Norman county system. They use English. They have a parochial attitude, which in many ways, Tolkien believes summarized the English. He himself believed that the work of, the idea of Bilbo Baggins was in some way autobiographical. So what I'm sort of elucidating is that all of these elements where we see tangents which could be explicitly linked to some sort of proto-history of the English, whether it be the Hobbits or whether it be the Rohirrim, the elements of English are taking place in a story which is actually detached from the real mythology of England, the Silmarillion, which is focusing purely on the mainly, not purely, on the first stage. When we look at the fall of Numenor and the later Mannish history, which informs the Lord of the Rings, that is a contrivance much later that was only adapted from the Lost Road and the Notion Club papers, which was supposed to involve reincarnation and time travel and what have you. So if we drop the framing device, if we drop the idea of Tolerancia, if we drop Elfwine, and we instead, adopt this non-framing device, or we adopt the Red Book of Westmarch, which again has a Welsh analog to the Matter of Britain, not an English comparison, then I think what we are left is with something far more confused than just something you can say is a pure English mythology. I mean, derisively. Who's the author of this? Stenström says in this article that phonetically, what Tolkien was trying to create with Sindarin and Quenya was something closer to Italian. So if the language, if the language and the mythology are supposed to coincide, essentially, then why have you created something which is phonetically Italian? So you're saying, on the one hand, you could say that Tolkien's linguistic, and again, these are my points, which I think are much stronger than the arguments put forward by Stenström. If you're talking and prioritizing linguistic aesthetics, phonetics above this idea of weaving in a mythology, then you've already created some sort of discrepancy. How I resolve that in my head is the fact that these are languages belonging to a primordial people, which are not of the English, essentially, not of the race of men who become the English. So to me, that isn't as devastating as Stenström believes at all. Regarding the various historical sort of allusions to Finnish, Celtic, what have you, and of course the overall result that it sounds like Italian, that's another question entirely. But I think the more devastating fact about this is that you enter into the third world, you have created the Rohirric and Shire civilizations, yet you have at the same time abandoned the framing device, which links this back to the destruction of Old Beleriand and the creating of the island of England, which then becomes the subject of the real world history you're meant to bring in. So you have to resolve these things by bringing in elements such as time travel, which, as we see, the Notion Club papers was an idea, it was a formula, but it was never sort of fully realized. So what I'm left with is a complicated picture. What I think we can all say is that the Book of Lost Tales, the earliest incarnation of the Silmarillion, is probably the closest thing in terms of the framing, but also in terms of the spirit, to what could have emerged as a history, a mythology for England. But I think what we have now created, essentially, because I haven't called this series a mythology for England. I couldn't really call it a mythology for England. I've called it the Matter of Middle Earth as an alternative to the Ardaranyë, which is the idea of, the kingdom of Arda. And I think this has sort of created this weird idiosyncrasy where there are elements of a mythology of England wedded to this idea. It informs a huge part of the construction of the Silmarillion, but the result and the fraught nature of establishing a framing device, and of course I think the death of Tolkien, which meant that we don't have a fully realized work, means that we don't have a matter for England, but rather, as Verlyn Flieger would call it, but rather we end up with a matter for Middle Earth, which has all of these compound layers informing the world from all aspects, literary allusions from all aspects of all, tangents of European mythology. Anyway, that's the end of my very long tangent, so please speak, Nathan.
I mean, that was quite brilliant and quite devastating. And there's a lot to unpack there. I guess I fundamentally agree with your idea that it's a matter for Middle Earth. But if I was to try and steelman the kind of mythology for England idea, we might appeal to the hyper-Trojan mythos as a kind of basis here, because if the Silmarillion, if the languages kind of undergirding the Silmarillion are Italian or Mediterranean, and we can see in the Silmarillion itself, we find out that Erendil, who is descended from this culture, is the forefathers of the Númenóreans and of later elves. So you could perhaps see there then that there's a lineage to the Lord of the Rings, which perhaps as well is less mythology and more Tolkien talks about the Arthurian legends, and perhaps it's more akin to that for the English than the mythology. I know that's a pedantic point, but he felt the Arthurian legend was unrealized in certain ways. It wasn't sufficient, and perhaps the Lord of the Rings also has that character too. So maybe there's a parallel there.
Well, I think again, I really want to emphasize that my language remark is there are pedantic elements to it, which I will acknowledge. It's a nitpick, but nitpicks are still valid, even if they're minor.
I think
But
Tolkien would have appreciated nitpicking language as well. So
absolutely. So we can critique Tolkien on this. We are permitted to critique Tolkien on this, but it's not the massive problem which Stenström makes it out to be. The fact that you can say that there was this personal observation when it came to language, where he was using Welsh and Finnish to create something which sounded phonetically Italian. That to him is a devastating argument, which basically establishes the fact that this is a personal mythology rather than a mythology for England. And yes, there is, to some extent, there is a personal mythology. I think the fact it was never finished, and the fact it was never printed in some form or form which is publicly accessible is a much better argument for saying that this was a personal mythology rather than a mythology for England. Yet again, Tolkien would have acknowledged the fact that he had created all these stories, he had created all these various devices, and in the tradition of a true matter. Even when we're talking about Homer's worst example, but the matter of Britain, the matter of France is a better example. There is no single authority, literary authority, when we're talking about these matters, and so it is again. He has begun, essentially. He is the wellspring of this new mythology for England, mythology for Middle Earth, matter for Middle Earth, what have you, and from it, essentially, you can develop these stories. I think what is paradoxical to me, however, is that is a medieval notion. That is a sort of I hesitate to use the word, but dark age notion. Again, it's a word I don't use often. But the point is, we're talking about him employing a medieval conception for writing a matter in the 20th century. When you have modern publishers and you have the Lord of the Rings. I think one of the most devastating aspects of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit is that it obscured the nature of the mythology, and I think it fundamentally changed the nature of the mythology. I think Christopher Tolkien is completely correct in the sense that the wonderful thing about the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit is that it is a beautiful vantage point from which all of these characters, the hobbits in particular, and you mentioned the songs that they sing, can reference and talk about this vast history. And that could be the entry point, the way that we inquire about this ancient world through the hobbits, who are basically character standards, can then enter into this vast mythology. But I think in that case, you have diminished the idea of Tolkien's mythology for England, because instead of what could have been a English Kalevala, you have instead created the backstory for a fictional masterpiece, which is the Lord of the Rings.
And we can actually see that change in the attitude as well, insofar as you start then seeing special publications of particular stories from the Silmarillion. So, like the Children of Hurin or Beren and Luthien, they become they're almost presented as first stage stories which are like the Lord of the Rings in some way or another in the kind of edited editions we have now, with the same artists who did the artwork for the Lord of the Rings, for example. So you do see that that shift has really fed back into it.
Well, talking, contemporary events, look at the films. When you look at The Hobbit, even, I mean, The Hobbit should really be the least example of this, because The Hobbit is a realized work. But even when we talk about the Hobbit films were not conceived as the Hobbit book. They were conceived as a prequel trilogy for the Lord of the Rings. What is the new Amazon series announced as its title? Yes, The Rings of Power was a title used by Tolkien, but it's the fact that they are relaying this back to the Lord of the Rings. This is a backstory informing the Lord of the Rings. This is not a grand mythology of which the Lord of the Rings was an incidental offshoot, which is of course the actual result of that, which I find fascinating. So if we are to talk about the creation, this ongoing creation, this idea that you have created a body of work and other people will come and adapt it. Well, this new Amazon series could be the perfect example of that. They are applying dialogue and they're embellishing stories to something which seldom has that at all. I mean, I'm not even sure which part of the which ages they're responding to necessarily. But when we see this, I very much doubt it's going to be in the spirit of which Tolkien would have appreciated. But moreover, it seems based on the marketing alone, it is very much capitalizing on the association with the Third Age with the Lord of the Rings. So again, just talking about this idea that the work has, if we're talking about this idea that Tolkien didn't want there to be one single voice, one authorial statement, then the way it has evolved essentially is simply as this backstory, this information behind the Lord of the Rings. But going back just earlier, going further back to the language point, again, another reason I don't find the language so devastating. Look at the history of England. The history of England is informed by Roman civilization, it is informed by Celtic civilization, and it is informed by Jewish civilization, and the Christian civilization coming off it. So it therefore makes completely sense linguistically that any true mythology of England, which is actually wedded to history, would have all of these linguistic elements. And to me, it makes sense that Ardaranyë, the language associated with the Númenóreans, has this Semitic tinge to it, because then one draws the connection with the Kingdom of David, and that was another comparison I brought to Aragon. And of course, another thing which Tolkien was loath to talk about was the Anglo-Norman influence, but then again, one can draw that connection to Charlemagne. There are many sort of linguistic elements alluding to these areas of history, and I think within that you have the Rohirric element, and you have the Shire element representing, the true elements of English contained within that story, but they don't form the entire world, as that was certainly the case within medieval England, and that these languages wouldn't have formed the entire world. I mean, for goodness sake, the intellectual language wasn't English. If it wasn't French, it would have been Latin. So the multilingual nature of medieval England, I think, is informed by the multilingual nature of the Lord of the Rings. And I think, again, this isn't, as Stenström believes, a detraction, but really I think you can again read this into the historicity and add to that, and then nitpick and critique the various inspirations for those languages, which Tolkien may have prioritized for aesthetics over historicity. But nevertheless, to me, the most devastating part is, again, the fact that the Lord of the Rings has happened, and the Lord of the Rings is informing the construction of the Silmarillion, not really the other way around. And the fact that we have a framing device which has disconnected the specific, basically English origin story, and this idea of a Tower of Lore based in the the Cottage of Lost Play, which is then received by Elfwine and then becomes part of the Wessex and then Anglo-Saxon English mythos.
Perhaps a useful comparison would be with C.S. Lewis here, in two respects. One is that in the creation of Narnia, the myths of Narnia are not thought to be connected to English mythology in any way. There's no attempt to kind of demonstrate this is actually a prior England. In fact, they're contemporaneous, but on different planes. Perhaps that second world that Tolkien was talking about. But if we look at the science fiction trilogy that Tolkien wrote, in That Hideous Strength, there's a passage near the end where the characters discuss how, for England, the true nature of England is Arthurian, and that the restoration of its Arthurian character is key to its survival and flourishing, which Lewis presents in contrast to modern Britain with its emphasis on progressivism. So you can see that there's a number of similarities in emphasis on receiving tradition, maintaining it, reciting it, and so on. But Lewis, in that book, doesn't attempt to create a new mythology, but reinforce an older one, perhaps, an older legendarium. And he can do that more successfully, I think, because it already exists, and thus the world is not in any way disrupted by that. Whereas I think the points you've made about Tolkien's, they can't match up to what Lewis can achieve in that short passage, I think.
And I think just to summarize this, because we really should get onto the super chats, there have been quite a few, so probably a lot to talk about. To my mind, you can't disassociate you can't relate back to this pedantic idea of looking at the the actual sort of origins of the quotation of mythology for England. I think it's obvious, not just from the I hate to use the word, but authorities we have on the subject, and how this historiographically plays very much part into revisionism, which hasn't caught on at all. But it's more the fact that, to me, it is very clear in the early writings of the Silmarillion. And what we see is that we see a work, an evolving, you can say, personal mythology that loses focus and becomes something you could say not entirely different, but its character is shaped by the much more successful published iteration of it during Tolkien's lifetime, which is The Lord of the Rings. And I think even if you look at the Red Book of Westmarch as a framing device, again, you're framing this as part of the lore of Middle-earth, the matter of Middle-earth, rather than the matter of England. And I think that's really all I have to say in summation as to how we understand this. But what I hope we've achieved in this little talk is emphasizing the value of myth, and how, when talking about Tolkien, we are just overwhelmed with all of these, applications, allusions, inspirations. But also, when we look at the whole nature of the work in terms of the framing, in terms of the possible use of reincarnation, time travel, this Christian element working its way through, Tolkien studies is almost inexhaustible in that way in terms of understanding this work. And I hope we've justified the existence of this podcast, to say the least.
Most definitely. And I think the thing that's really jumped out to me during this conversation, which has been thoroughly enjoyable, just beyond the points being made, is that the importance for us in our own time to think about these issues, and the importance of mythology as a marker of our own identity. I know others have spoken about how we basically live in a society constructed on certain myths about World War II. And so maybe we need to think about recovering beyond that, you know.
Yes, a subtle allusion to academic agent, or go and check out his channel. Anyway, onto the super chats. Philippocrit for €5, thank you very much. I've recently been enjoying the interplay between logos and the logic which unfolds from it. These false logos inhabiting man leads to perverse logic. Very much indeed, we're seeing that in action right now. John Boy for €10. There is a relationship between lore, Lore, and law, morality and language, and narrative, which supports and integrates cultures. That's what I get from this. Yes, I think I hate to sort of say law in that way. I mean, to me, law, as we understand it today, is almost sort of, and the value of language, I think very much represents this diversion, this warp, this idea that the law can be anything you want it to be, and the purpose of the interpreter of the law is to interpret it any way which have you, to result in a favorable verdict. I think in terms of all the baggage and connotations that come out with modern law, I think I would rather associate this idea with language as pertaining to the original spirit of the language, language as incarnate in the logos, the word which creates existence, and we become the sub-creators. The emphasis of language as construed of religiously, but as conceived of by Tolkien, is the fact that all of these things are supposed to be working in harmony with the purpose of the original creation. Whereas what I find about just using that word law, just looking at it, I wince slightly, because again, it's this association with the perversions and the corruption and the recontextualization, reinterpretation of language, just to bolster that. But in terms of an implicit law, and a language in that spirit that supports and integrates cultures, yes, absolutely. And that's the cornerstone of you can say the particularism exhibited in Tolkien's various cultures, etc., but also in the purpose of the story itself, beginning with the Ainu Lindale, which will be the subject for our next stream.
I guess as well, just on building on what you've just said, is that by its very nature, then, language is disruptive to the creative language is disruptive to that which seeks to suppress it. So if there's laws which seek to suppress language in certain ways, by its very nature, language with its kind of transcendent power is always going to cause it problems. You see this in the very nature of Lord of the Rings, insofar as it needs to be that even when people try to change it, its inner spirit always breaks through in one way or another. So I think that's something to ponder, how we can use language more effectively to disrupt in a creative way, or recover in a creative way.
And I think that's absolutely true. Thank you very much for that, Nathan. Lady of Shalott for £4.49. Thank you very much. The Silmarillion received mixed reviews on publication in 1977. Some critics argued it lacked a band of brothers or a single narrative. Any thoughts? Well, sadly, that's pretty much true. I mean, we've talked about the controversy surrounding Christopher Tolkien's uh, various, his edition of the Silmarillion, and how he can't really be blamed because he was very much following in the footsteps and trends which Tolkien was pursuing. I think the one thing you can fault him on is the fact that the Red Book of Westmarch and the Elvish translations of Bilbo is established canon within the Lord of the Rings. So you could have brought back the old Elfwine Ariel framing device with Pengalod and Rumil as well. But you could have linked this back to Lord of the Rings with Bilbo possibly being the narrator in order to have some form of connection, because again, the reason why the Hobbits work so well and they're so popular, in addition to the nostalgic feelings one can get out of that, and the yearning of affinity with the countryside, or whatever sort of people get out of the value of the Hobbits. And again, I'm really trying to limit this in order for the sake of time. I'm not trying to dismiss Hobbits in a way, but essentially what Tom Shippey talks about is the fact that Hobbits are purposefully anachronistic. They are elements from our world. They speak a form of, archaic English, which is more or less understandable, which are dropped into this fantasy setting, and they become not only the heroes of that story, but they're also our fish out of water. They're our point of access. So there are some more learned hobbits who are able to, speak Elvish and interact with some of the other figures who, again, tower in stature compared to the hobbits who are embarking on this great journey. But I think that aspect of it, the fact that they do the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit has a fish out of water story, which is relatable. I hate to use these trite sort of English story framework devices, but I think that is key to understanding why an aspect of why the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit were so successful. The Silmarillion has nothing like that. There is no mediation. There is no framing device, which has been opted out of it. And you talk about the fact that there isn't a single narrative. Well, there is a through line. There is a through line throughout all of it, which we'll get into more in detail, which is about the fundamental conflict between the harmony of creation against those who wish to destroy it. However, we're talking about we're talking possibly about 60,000 years of history, probably a bit less than that, probably about 50,000 to 60,000 years of history, from the Ainu Lindale, from the years of lamps, the years of trees, throughout the first age, the second age, and the third age. Roughly, the second age and the third age are around 3,000 years, and the first age is a little bit shorter than that. So we're talking a vast span of history, and it's impossible to maintain any sort of continuity with the characters when, like with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, you're talking about a story which takes place over a few years as opposed to many dozens of millennia. And in terms of, and of course there are various stories within that. You have the Valaquenta, which is just essentially a lore piece talking about the various the nature of the various Valar. You have the Quenta Silmarillion, which is the Silmarillion proper, which is the closest thing you have to a narrative, essentially. But even that story takes place over thousands of years and contains many stories within it. And then you have various allusions to, like we mentioned, of the Rings of Power and the summary of the War of the Ring. So the Silmarillion encompasses everything. What the Lord of the Rings was so successful at was establishing you midway in the conflict. You have this massive world informing this story, and you can imbibe it, you can absorb it through these fish out of water characters, which really isn't the case with the Silmarillion. I mean, I remember the first time I tried reading the Silmarillion, I got halfway through the Quenta Silmarillion and I stopped reading because the feel of it is completely different from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And even at a very young age, I found The Lord of the Rings still quite difficult to get through. As people notice, I don't read much fiction, and certainly didn't as a child. I've always found it rather difficult. Obviously it's something I've forced to learn in later life since university. But nevertheless, I can understand why it received mixed reviews and why it was rejected for publication so many times. But anyway, I've talked so often. Nathan, what are your thoughts on this?
I suppose you can see why certain stories from the Silmarillion have been republished as single tales, such as the Children
Absolutely.
of Huron,
Yes.
in which you do have that through line. You do have a character which you can focus on. They're still not the same as the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit in the kind of relatability, so they still lack that aspect. But it's more akin to something like reading stories about King Arthur or
Mhm.
the Iliad or something like that.
Nathan?
Whereas perhaps the random narratives. Hello,
Hello?
hello.
Hello? I can hear you.
Oh, did I fade out there?
You,
Sorry.
you faded out very briefly, but I got most of what you were saying.
Yeah. I guess what you could say though is that there are certain families which are very central to
Yeah.
the grand narrative of the Silmarillion, and if you take it in that sense, then there is much more of a through line. But
But
yes.
again, I'm going to point out though that even though lineage is very important for informing the world, I think character is the central thing that people relate to. And
Yes.
even if you have lineage, character is still lost in that. So I can definitely understand the mixed reviews. And as I mentioned the rather damning assessment by Dr. Olson before coming on, which basically said that essentially the history of Middle Earth as we have it is a Silmarillion. It's just a different type of Silmarillion. It's not a published fantasy work. This is the scholarly edition of all of Tolkien's work, lovingly compiled. I mean, I really do think Christopher Tolkien is probably the best son you could possibly ever imagine. The amount of work he put into making Tolkien's legacy accessible to all of us. I mean, it really is utterly remarkable. And when I refer to the Silmarillion, I'm not really referring to the 1977 publication. I'm really referring to the history of Middle Earth, which encompasses things which I'm going to omit because, like Charles Node said in that article I read, I'm having to think of canon and I'm having to think of everything which is internally consistent. And there are some elements which are dropped, and this is very much a chronicle of the production. And so, for example, like I mentioned, we have a whole Silmarillion in the first 2 volumes. It's the Book of Lost Tales. But when I'm going to be, going back and going over and trying to formulate some sort of chronology, I'm going to be going with the most advanced iterations of those works. So it's complicated to say the least, but all I have to say is there is a version, inaccessible as it is, of the Silmarillion out there for you to read if you can stomach it. John Boy for €5. I wonder if the tradition of fairies, etc., the little people living under the hill as a race, memory of modern humans interacting with Neanderthals. I mean, the whole fairy tradition. There is an aspect of the Cottage of Lost Play, where what we later see is the elves, the fair and beautiful peoples, which are very much indicative of, you can say, true mythology, true pagan mythology at the time of the Christianization of Germany and the Celtic countries. The whole sort of notion, the Victorian notion of the diminutive stature of fairies, plays through into that idea. I don't think Tolkien sort of vilified that later, especially in his conception of elves in Lord of the Rings, who bear sort of no tradition to the fairies, the little people living under the hills. And again, I think if you mention that, I'm not trying to be mean, but if you mention that connection with Neanderthals and fairies, I think Tolkien would be very scathing. But the point, I think possibly, I'm not sure whether this could be a connection, but possibly you can draw some form of connection with that and the creations of Aule. I don't want to say it explicitly because I might get banned off YouTube for saying that. But that's a possibility. But no, to me, the obvious association with fairies, elves is obvious. It is the rather ambivalent, amoral, yet supremely fair and magical creatures of Norse German mythology. The sort of ones that men such as the what was the character who was the human sacrifices, which also influenced the the great marshes and anyway, I'm going down a different point. But you had bogmen, essentially. You had fairies and you had bogmen in Germany in primordial era. And all of these inform aspects of Tolkien. Tolkien was obviously familiar with all of them. I think Bogman was a recent phenomenon that was only popping up during the time that Tolkien was writing the Lord of the Rings. Probably one influence for the Dead Marshes, for example, is the Battle of the Somme. The other, I think, is to this illusion of human sacrifice during German pagan times. But I think trying to stretch the analogy of fairies to Neanderthals is something that Tolkien would have sadly reviled. Just for the sake of your super chat, John Boy, I know how wonderful you have been in contributing to the channel. Anyway, Nathan, any thoughts on that?
Just another influence that would have influenced little people at the very least is in George MacDonald's fairy story Lilith. There's a group of children who call themselves the Little People, and they're rather naive and very honest and open, but their honesty means that they're unable to see the kind of danger of the world, and that strikes me as quite similar to hobbits in many ways.
Philippa Crit for €2. Architecture and gardening are not so different. Yes, I think that. The reason I was bringing out that comparison was because of the explicit differentiation given by George R. R. Martin, who for some reason has decided to take upon himself to become the modern critic of Tolkien in the public sphere, something which I really do not appreciate, given he clearly doesn't understand Tolkien. I'm not really saying that to be mean. I mean, I appreciate, I've read his books, and I appreciate, George R. R. Martin as a writer. But what I find frustrating about Martin is that I do believe he is a postmodernist writer of a completely different tradition and orientation, who is relying on those tropes established by fantasy literature to be able to convince you that something will happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. Whereas what he's actually writing is a very nihilistic historical account in many ways, with some fantasy elements, such as the dragons and the White Walkers, etc. His vision of war is completely different from Tolkien. Tolkien was not a pacifist. Tolkien believed that war could be just in the Christian sense, but Martin's association is that war, he's vehemently anti-war. He came out as an anti-Vietnam War protester. War is completely grotesque and meaningless. And of course, when one has to dedicate one's resources, one has to ultimately fight it in service of ending climate change. If you're going to get the unification of all peoples together to fight the White Walkers analogy there. But what I was getting at essentially is the fact that he fundamentally misunderstood what Tolkien was getting at, and Tolkien's whole process of creation, which is there was no set plan from the beginning. Rather, the nature of the Silmarillion progressed and indeed did not complete over the process of 50 years. And I've often heard that Martin effectively uses that as a straw man to justify why he will never finish the books. But there you are. Any thoughts, Nathan?
I think he should finish his books and retire.
Yes, I mean, he doesn't really have, as far as I'm concerned, he should cease everything. He should just lock himself in a prison cell until he finishes those bloody books. But there you are.
I wonder though if he's written himself into a corner in part because, as many of you will know from the much hated ending of the TV series, Jon Snow comes back to life, and Martin famously reviled Tolkien for doing the same with Gandalf. So if that comes to pass in his own book, he'll never live it down. So maybe that's why he's never finishing it.
Well, the funny thing is about that, obviously, he says that he should never have brought Gandalf back, despite the fact that the Gandalf we get back in Two Towers is not Gandalf the Grey in any stretch. He is Saruman as he was supposed to have been.
Yes.
But looking over, what could happen after a dance with dragons, what happened with Jon Snow was the exact opposite. Jon Snow came back essentially as the same character, and if anything, he became worse. He degenerated as a character. He didn't come back as a fundamentally new character. And in fairness to George R. R. Martin, when he has brought other characters back to life who we know of, so we can actually draw a fair comparison with Lord of the Rings, like Lady Stoneheart and Catelyn Tully, they have fundamentally changed in character. So maybe, the only case of resurrection in the show, other than Beren Dondarrion being sort of Jon Snow, I think when we look at the show, I mean, I hope desperately that if he ever finishes the books, they will be better done than the show. I'm not sure whether I'll ever talk on Game of Thrones season 8. I think the wonderful thing about Game of Thrones season 8 is that collectively it has basically terminated any enthusiasm in the Game of Thrones franchise, which is rather remarkable. I don't think anything has been as influential and as powerful as Game of Thrones, and to have been completely eradicated so decisively in such a short amount of time. As far as I'm aware, Academic Agent still enjoys the whole sort of sway of sort of Game of Thrones. So maybe I should try and challenge him to talk about the TV series, of course, not the books, when it comes to how the endings seem.
He's a deeply subversive character, that Academic Agent.
Marcus Trajan, season 5 onwards were his. Yes, I mean, to my mind, the ending of the show was getting rid of Tyrion Lannister's motivations for killing Tywin because of Shay. In reality, it's because how have I forgotten his wife? Tyrion Lannister's wife, don't you? What's her name? Anyway, actually, no, that's going into a different tangent. I won't go down that line. But as far as I'm concerned, it ends at the end of season 4, even before season 5, botching the assassination of Tywin. Who also happens to be my hero character, John Gordon, for $9.99. Thank you very much. Do you consider that Tolkien's work as a legitimate English mythology? Tolkien's works are definitely more mainstream than mythology stories of England, Wales, and Scotland. I think we've done that I think we've covered that pretty comprehensively, wouldn't you say, Nathan?
Yeah, I agree. We've kind of covered that.
I mean, in terms of the mainstream argument, that's the sort of point we were making, is that the fact that it became mainstream, and the fact it wasn't the Silmarillion that became mainstream, it was the fact that the inadvertent offshoot of the Hobbit became mainstream, the Lord of the Rings, means that the whole nature of the work and the perception of the work has completely muddled this idea of a mythology for England. So much so that I think if you talk to a layman who has only watched the films and you say this was Tolkien's attempt to create a mythology of England, they will just look at you aghast and say, what on earth does that mean? Because it's convoluted, especially when you look at the films, and that's your only point of access. This idea that this is some sort of work of legitimate English mythology, cast through the eyes of Lord of the Rings, I think has fundamentally affected the work, and fundamentally affected Tolkien when he came back to revise the works after publishing Lord of the Rings, trying to fit this in and make this essential part of the mythology.
I think the question hits something deeper within our own tradition, which is that we have no traditions now. Well, that at least is our kind of meta narrative for the modern West, that we are just free floating and we choose whatever identities we want. But underlying that is the World War II tradition. We're getting new traditions more recently in the last couple of years. It won't be hard for your audience to think about what those might be. But in essence, we've decimated that idea that we have a tradition. So it's quite hard then, even if Tolkien's work was presented in that way, the reason why it's so absurd in part is because we've been trained not to have a mythology.
Yes, that. I think that's a fundamentally important task. I mean, if we're talking about, again, bringing Semigog's points into this, these idea about centers of orientation and about markings rather than language as demarcation points, I think this is very important to understand, that there is nothing sort of, I think there is something very primordial which they speak to, which is why they are so relatable. And why I think there is a hidden reactionary in us, even if we can't understand it or articulate it. There is something existing there in the subconscious. But even though I'm sure someone will point out that is a very a leftist way of construing it through the Freudian analysis, but there you are. I think the point understands the yearning is there, but any sort of formulation, any sort of point of orientation, any sort of understanding, any collective consciousness is gone. And so, as you mentioned, it's not just the fact that Tolkien wasn't able to produce something which was coherent in terms of an English mythology, has aspects to it, but it is not it. It is not simply an English mythology. It is very difficult, therefore, for someone who isn't trained to relate this back to how it could possibly be construed as an English mythology, because that understanding, that basis, that common collective consciousness simply does not exist.
Take Lewis's idea of the C.S. Lewis one as Lewis's idea of the Arthurian legend, which is maybe the closest thing you could possibly get. It would just be absurd to most people now. They just wouldn't comprehend it. I can't comprehend how that could be a mythology for us today, and so that probably speaks volumes.
The Thin Red Line for $10. I think the Third Age is quite closely related to the early medieval ages, and the Ring War is the Hunnic onslaught culminating in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. Well, it's not that simple. I mean, as with everything, there is no direct constraining allegory, and again, I'm using Tolkien's conception of allegory, which is narrow. My own definition is much broader than that. But if we are to view allegory as exact and therefore constraining, I would almost say allegory as conceived of again during the but probably before the 19th century, when you did have literary and artistic allegories which were meant as direct representations or allusions. But I think coming to the Hunnic onslaught, it should be mentioned that the orcs aren't people, and that there are allusions. I mean, people have talked about this no end, the fact that the orcs have to have some sort of inspiration for real life people, and I'm not going to get into that here because it infuriates me, but there are allusions one can draw, not just with the Huns. I think the Huns is quite a good example, actually, because the Huns in themselves represented they weren't a culture so much as they were just a military force. They represented a series of cultures. I mean, one of the fascinating things that Tolkien encountered is that he wouldn't draw any reference to Attila in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, because of the etymological origins of that. Attila isn't Hunnic, Attila is Visigothic, and in Visigothic, Attila is the diminutive of father, which wouldn't have made any sense in an etymological reconstruction of a world within the setting of Lord of the Rings. But again, that sort of represents the even though some Hungarians draw this connection to Attila and the Huns today, their real history comes much later with the Magyar migrations in the 8th and the 9th centuries. But they're leeching onto that tradition. I'm not quite sure why, but if Attila the Hun was going to create something which wasn't just destructive and devastating, he died before it could be achieved. So that's one possible illusion one can bring. But if you're talking about the Middle Ages, I think one example I brought in, bringing Ovid and Hesiod, is this idea of the ages possibly corresponding to the golden, the silver, the bronze, and the iron ages of man. I don't think it's fair to say that the Third Age is an iron age. I think the Iron Age, if we had it, is the Fourth Age, and really yonder. This is the Bronze Age, the heroic age, the last age, where supernatural forces really partake in a substantive way to influence the world of men before we enter into the world of institutions, the world of nations, the world of borders, the world of armies, professional armies, everything that we would conceive of as being the basis of some sort of modernity in the medieval period and the early modern period. So it's an interesting influence, I definitely say. I mean, when we did that stream, Nathan, on the inspirations behind the Middle Earth, that was definitely one of the influences we talked about. But I would advise against ever sort of just ascribing one literary allusion to, or historical allusion to all of it. But that's certainly a angle one can bring in, and I think it's very informative. I mean, just to substantiate your points at the Thin Red Line, the etymology of Theoden is Theodorex, which means Theoden king, who was, of course, the Federati commander of the Visigoths in service of Aetius, who was you could say the Gondorian surrogate, the commander of the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. So the fact that that battle had major influence on the construction of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is obvious. And if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend reading Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey. Anything to say, Nathan?
Nope, nothing more to add.
Machiavelli Sucks to Go says for $5, a big part of England was TALS. Are you trying to? Can you read that? Am I reading it wrong, or am I trapping myself?
I wasn't sure what it meant, but it never sounds good if somebody's doing that. But maybe it's trying to get around the algorithm. I don't know.
All right, I can't believe YouTube censors. All right, tally sticks. Apparently, that's supposed to be tally sticks.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for your super chat, Machiavelli Sucks to Go. Anyway, it's been over 2 hours. I think that's a good time to end this, and I think we've actually hopefully achieved this goal. Hopefully, people know what the Silmarillion is now before we actually embark on it in earnest. I hope you've had a nice time, Nathan. Just to get onto this. Thank you again to my wonderful patrons, and of course, Nathan, is there anything you want to tell us about before you go?
Well, first, just a massive thank you for having me on. It's been really enjoyable, and I've learned a lot from this discussion. On the 10th of February, on my channel, there's going to be a live stream discussing one of C.S. Lewis's science fiction books, That Hideous Strength, and I'm going to be joined by hopefully Luke/Lambda, Gagging for Lit, Radlib, and Apostolic Majesty. So it's going to be a great time, really interesting discussion, and a really interesting book. So come along, 10th of February.
I just also want to point out that Mr. Patriarch was on the first hour of this stream. He had to go. We knew about it beforehand, but just to wish him well and to recommend to everyone to check out his wonderful history, theology, and politics channel. Do check out his channel. Other than that, thank you all very much for watching. And as for what's coming up on this channel, before I forget, tomorrow will be the 30 Years' War, and Monday will be the corresponding discussion for that. Otherwise, we'll be back to this series this time next week. Goodbye.